Hey, sovereign wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. We had a lot going on. We had a DeFi crash. We had Tether and stablecoins that were confiscated and frozen. We had Iran war week 8, and we had some major things with FX swap lines, as well as a hearing with Kevin Walsh, the new Fed chair, that after his regime change at the Fed. We're going to cover it all up today, and we're going to apply it and tie it all together, because really it is very important to understand the currency war that is quietly being negotiated and reformed in the background. And as usual, we're going to follow the money and go through everything. So this week is Iran war, week 8, the currency war. And we're going to be looking at how crude, how WTI, how oil, how gold, and how FX swaps are effectively reshaping money. But most people don't know what's happening because they're not following the money in the correct way. And we're going to go through all the details. We're going to do it in 2 parts, as always. In part 1, I'm going to be going through the currency war. We're going to be going through gold, Yuan, oil, and the future of the dollar and its dominance that we're witnessing right now. And then in part 2, I'm going to go over to an interview I did on the 19th of April on Simply Bitcoin YouTube channel. And it's how the banking system turned you into a debt slave. I want to make sure you understand it so that you can be protecting yourself. So let's jump straight in with part 1, the currency war, gold, yuan, oil, and the future of dollar dominance. So let's remember what we have been doing over the last few weeks. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Don't worry, you don't need to watch all the old videos. You're welcome to on SimonDixon.com. But in week 1, we went through the opening shock, the shock and awe campaign that there is a war with Iran, and US's involvement, Iran's involvement, and Israel's involvement. And we covered what we predicted and what we thought was going to be happening. In week 2, we went through the escalation phase. And this is where everyone really thought we're going to World War III. No one's negotiating. We're headed into nuke. Israel's going to do the Samson option. And I was saying behind the scenes, I believe that there is negotiations, and started covering what I thought this operation was. Now, I thought it was going to be faster. I didn't think it would be this long. And I think we are in for longer than anticipated, as I've understood the goals as this has progressed. And it's way more ambitious than the 12-day war in terms of the outcomes. And it wasn't until week 3 that I said, we're going to enter into the settlement phase where everyone said we're not negotiating. And we ended up with a 15-point framework later from US, and a 10-point framework, and then later the Pakistan meetings. In week 4, I was sharing how the targets are going to impact global markets. And this is the Build Back Better phase. Essentially, we had a war between the financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, which are all aligned but different factions of power. And I went through the different factions of power, and then said that we're going to get to an end agreement, which will be a currency war and a commodity repricing event. And what is targeted, whoever builds it back, will be the ones that effectively are on the right side of the renegotiation. So we talked about the GCC, we talked about the China Belt and Road Initiative, and we talked about BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and the financial industrial complex, and how they manage a portfolio of the military industrial complex and the technical industrial complex. And in the Build Back Better phase, you go through funding the war and profiting from the war, destroying and leveling the field, to the rebuilding military profits move to more financial profits. And then you have the police and surveillance state and the technical industrial complex that benefit from it. In week 5, we covered the market confirmation that we are actually in a reset. We talked about the bond market. We talked about the oil market. We talked about how the bond market, once it hits 4.5% on the 10-year yield, 5% on the 30-year yield, and $115 on the 1-month future oil, Brent crude oil, we enter into a capitulation event and a theatrical move that makes it look like the war's escalating, leading to a de-escalation phase, a check-in phase, and the markets will always tell us when that was happening. And then they can't let the bond market fail. So when those yields go up, you have to have a capitulation that comes from higher oil prices. And then money needs to be led to the big print, which props up the stock markets, and also dumps the debt on the American people. But eventually, as foreign countries start selling their debt, the Fed will purchase that debt in a big print, which we're still waiting for. The market gave us all those confirmations. Week 6, I covered the final act and said, one, a couple of things are being left on the negotiation table. Lebanon, which is Lebanon and Hezbollah, which was left on the negotiation table. And then the end game, and the global reset, and what this will look like in terms of the multipolar world order once we're done. In week 7, last week, I covered the real war, where we went through the energy force majeure contracts, who's benefiting from it, the role of Russia, Iran, OPEC, the financial industrial complex, Cheniere Energy, Exxon, Chevron, the Golden Pass, which is 70% owned by Qatar, 30% Exxon, and then China's role as the manufacturing base, and how that impacts the different supply chains, and how that leads to a situation where Iran is deeply vassalized into China and BRICS. Israel is deeply vassalized into the GCC, and the US bases are rebuilt under a multipolar world order, than the US being the sole global hegemon. And the different types of choke points and system control via shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, and all the different knock-on effects on the 50 different repricing events of all the different commodities. Now, in week 8, I'm going to focus primarily in the currency war. I'll be tying it into current events domestically in US, as well as globally with Bitcoin, DeFi, stablecoins, as well as on the battlefield, the Middle East and BRICS, GCC, and the different private corporate financial industrial complex, and OPEC oil companies, and what that actually means in terms of monetary flows, gold flows, Bitcoin flows, stablecoin flows, and basically the rewriting of money that we are witnessing right now. So, in a brief summary, for those of you that may be new, as a quick summary, the US, the UK, the EU, and the collective West are all controlled by the same, what I call financial industrial complex. That's a network of central banks, investment banks, retail banks, asset managers, private equity, venture capital. They control capital flows, and governments are fully subordinate to them through the insurance lobby, the financial lobby, the military lobby, the technical lobbies, various other lobby groups that I've covered in my proof of weapons network. But essentially, the Western interest, the governments work for private corporate interest, and they control government. So Trump is not negotiating for America. Starmer is not negotiating for the UK. The European Union is not negotiating for the Europeans. It is effectively private corporate interests managed by the financial industrial complex. So once you understand that, you understand that the EU is effectively being vassalized into US LNG companies. And this will likely be supplied by Cheniere Energy and Golden Pass. And both of those are located in Texas, but they are not America. America doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund. The Americans pay the debt. They get the burden of the national debt. The financial industrial complex receives the yield, and they are shareholders in the Fed, and the Fed pays a 6% dividend to its shareholders based upon the assets on its balance sheet, subject to certain parameters. And the yield on the debt covers what you pay on your mortgage, your auto loans, your credit card, and various other things. But that is a wealth extraction exercise in a K-shaped economy. Now, the oil companies are not an American sovereign wealth fund. So the benefit goes to the 1% of GDP, which is a few companies, and the consumer, which is 60% of GDP. They pay higher prices while those companies make significant profits. But you get a narrative of this is MAGA, make America great again. No, this is wealth extraction over to the shareholder class as well. Now, remember, some of those companies, $69 trillion of the US is foreign controlled. And so the shareholder class is global multinational financial institutions. And it's mainly the FIC has partnered with all the different sovereign wealth funds. And those sovereign wealth funds is funded via China, who is purchasing all the energy and exports all the goods, and they all import. So they all have these alternative payment rails that sit outside the SWIFT system and the dollar system, which dominates most global transactions. But it means that it is subordinate to bondholders, those that are lending to the US government, to shareholders, those that own all the debt and equity markets, and the banks and financial institutions, which create the dollar every time they issue a loan in a debt-based Ponzi scheme, where they always roll it over on the people, the companies, and the governments, until you get massive wealth extraction and massive concentration of wealth in a K-shaped economy. Then you need a global reset where you price everyone out of the markets, and basically a few own all the assets and everyone else become renter class serfs and debt slaves. We cover a bit more about that in part 2 in the interview. So Golden Pass, which is benefiting from selling all this LNG, or one of the companies, and Cheniere Energy, it's 70% owned by Qatar, which had a chunk of its oil come offline because Iran targeted its LNG LNG manufacturing operations. So that needs to be rebuilt. That created a force majeure, cancellation of all contracts, and then renegotiating of those contracts at higher prices via this new financial industrial complex rail. And the rest of it is owned by Exxon as well. Now, the company that is going to most likely be refining all the oil from Venezuela is 100% a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco, which is the Saudi company that is fully owned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And a tiny amount of it, 2%, is floated on the stock market in order to renegotiate all these terms. Now, Saudi was able to have an alternative pipeline with UAE, which significantly reduced the amount of oil, pushes up the price, and creates this demand destruction. But there's all the other commodities and supply chains like fertilizers. But we also had distress in Taiwan that relies upon oil from the Strait of Hormuz, as well as South Korea, which relies upon oil from the Strait of Hormuz, as well as Netherlands. Now, they need to renegotiate with America and Norway as the sovereign wealth fund, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, and the financial industrial complex in America. But effectively, you had these repricing events, and the US military has become a for-rent militia group for transnational capital to go get resources and split it up. And anybody that is out of sync with that plan gets regime changed. So if Maduro wasn't on board with the plan, then you get regime changed. If higher levels of the IRGC are not on board with that plan, then they get regime changed until there is a version of the IRGC that is stable, regionally stable, but integrated with China's normalization plan that was brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that integrated BRICS backing into GCC corridors and all the alliances that fall out from that. And so Saudi is set to be the net beneficiary of this GCC shakeout, and China and Russia on the BRICS side. And then you have alternative parallel relationships like India, UAE. UAE is and China are the two largest trade partners of Iran. And so what looks like chaos on the front end, when you follow the trade routes, energy routes, and also UAE was the one that provided the financial infrastructure for Iran to circumvent sanctions, but also normalized via Abraham Accords with Israel, which was brokered via Western financial powers, which effectively is the reason why Saudi holding out on normalization, normalizing with Iran via China, and saying we will not normalize until there is a Palestinian state, you effectively expel the US dollar dependence and move it to a petrodollar and petro yuan, where Saudi and UAE and now Iran will be able to control those rails via OPEC, and via these alternative payment rails of SIPs, which is the China payment system integrated with 110 different countries, and the Enbridge network of central bank digital currencies, and then the stablecoin alternative rails, which the banks in America via Genius Act are making sure that you have to have a banking license. So you're plugged into the Fed system. And then they're having initiation campaigns for alternative tech companies like Coinbase, and various other ones that they're using in order to centralize as much Bitcoin. And we resist by having money outside the system, gold in self-custody, and Bitcoin in self-custody. We're going to go deeply into all of those and what happened this week. But effectively, Saudi Aramco is a subsidiary that's benefiting from the Venezuelan oil side and some of the more corrupt sides of the Zionists that need to be compensated, like Paul Singer, via Jared Kushner's fund for the Trump family that needs to be bribed via the $5 billion of affinity partners where Jared Kushner is managing. That's why he's at all the meetings. The bribe network, so that Trump benefits, which is funded by pressure from the sovereign wealth funds, which is leading to this transition. But there are factions of power that wouldn't be on board. The radical Zionists that are in regime survival mode at the moment that will be eventually regime changed, but Netanyahu has to provide his utility, which is aligned with the military industrial complex, the old world where America would be the hegemon. And that is the narrative of Zionism and Israel being our best ally is being destroyed via nodes in the network like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and various others. And then there are hardline elements of the IRGC that have created their power structure based upon the strategic tension between Iran and Israel, i.e. narratives like 2 weeks away from a nuke or death to America, death to Israel, that created an environment where a resistance economy was built. And so those that had genuine resistance against oppression, like in Palestine, in Gaza, and like the Houthis in Yemen, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like those various groups within Iraq after the Iraq war, they would be funded and supported via this Iran network that would give Iran strategic leverage after sanctions were imposed that created severe economic issues. And eventually, when those sanctions get removed, you use your leverage. But there are people left over in the IRGC which are kind of in a personal power, companies and various other things. And so they benefit from the status quo. So you need something like the 12-Day War, which was a more theatrical event, leading to a bigger theater like we're seeing right now. The deaths are real, everything's real, but the factions of power have negotiated the outcome and they're using different flows. And I believe there is an internal regime change happening in Iran, but it's not what was sold like, oh, right, we're saving the Iranian people. No, this is China's factions of the Reformist Party that had normalized to a Saudi. And then there are various hardliners that are coming out and derailing the plan, and you're getting false flags all over the place as well from the different factions of power. And finally, we're going to get to basically a sanction relief package, is my prediction, which changes everything. It changes currency. There's 3 to 4 million barrels of oil that come online. That needs to be done in cooperation with OPEC. What currency is it priced on? What's China's interest? What's the fixed interest? What are they leveraging? It changes so much, just making that change, because Iran is such an oil and a resource-rich country, and it is a massive, massive change. And when you don't need resistance anymore, the existence of Israel is no longer justified to be funded by the military in order to destabilize the region, which is what is effectively it was created for, when the Rothschilds created it and the British Empire way back in 1917 during World War I. And then obviously the change of empire happened from Britain to America, and its role became effectively using Gaza as a playground for testing surveillance, police, and military technology. And when the path to regional stability was coming, Israel's role had to change. And so that requires regime change and everything we're seeing right now. But there is a big power struggle there. So, anyway, meanwhile, the US, the EU, the UK, they have to pay higher prices because by constricting the amount of oil, by taking so much oil off the market, you create a demand destruction where people are willing to pay higher prices. But there then may be a structural deficit as well, which needs to be renegotiated in terms of contracts. So the average person pays higher prices. If you're not rich and you don't own the assets, then you're getting squeezed out of your wealth. And the debt is burdened upon the country, which is split between the people. And so the people get war debt, they get inflation, and they get food insecurity and structural problems. Now, one thing that's really important here, I always do this. If I was wearing my humanitarian hat, I would be speaking completely differently. These are crimes against humanity, human tragedies. I do all I can to support the humanitarian cause. But when I'm analyzing geopolitics, I have to take that out, be less human, and just talk about monetary flows and incentives. That is how I'm able to follow the money and try and make projections on what I think the different interests are so that you can think about what the real power behind the scenes is negotiating. And real power is not what you're seeing on the media. It's not what the politicians are telling you. It's not what the media is telling you. And so, anyway, the war debt, the inflation, and the recession that follows. Because the only way to adjust to these higher oil prices is not fixed by money printing. You can fix money printing in order to stimulate the stock market. But if you don't have oil and the oil prices are up, then you have to figure out how to not consume as much oil. And so everyone changes based upon that new paradigm. It changes behaviors, it changes alliances, it changes leverage, it changes everything. A recession follows, and then that leads to the justification for a big print. This is where any demand destruction by the FIC, they get bailed out. So then you socialize the losses, privatize the gains, get the rebuild contracts, and have the civil unrest that allows for the police and surveillance state, which the technical industrial complex uses. This is asset stripping the governments and the nation and the people for this FIC and FIC interest and the FIC portfolio. That is headed up by BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the sovereign wealth funds, and the surplus nations that are able to utilize the bond market and the equity market to get leverage by saying, I'll sell the bonds and I'll sell the equity, which allows them to leverage over American policy, which then influences the lobbies, and it goes through these capital flows network. Anyway, Trump works for the FIC. He's aligned with the FIC. Biden was more aligned with the MIC, but everyone still works for the FIC. And JD Vance is more TIC. He was groomed by Palantir, and there's that natural transition. So Biden created the open border policy, which justified all the, and then we had the delivery of the Russia war. Then Trump, more FIC aligned. And so we get renegotiation, closed borders, which justifies Palantir. And then we move into the police and surveillance state, likely under JD Vance, or they'll have their alternative Democrats, same result, different narrative, but same result, which moves into the TIC. And Trump is transitioning us. He was paid for by Elon Musk, a node in the TIC. He was paid for by the banking dynasty. If you look at his top three donators, the FIC nodes, and then also Mariam Edelstein, who's connected with Israel, Zionism, and the MIC. And so you can see his policies in terms of his financing, in terms of trying to predict behavior. And I said a long time ago, when people were like, do you think Trump will get elected? I said, it's not Harris. Trump is the chosen one because he has been chosen to escalate towards war with Iran, and then make people through tariff policy think that this transition to a multipolar world is actually MAGA while you shrink America into a regional power. And he's perfect for that role. And we had the different operations like before as well. Anyway, Now, in the nation state level, the people that actually have nationalized oil, Iran's benefiting, Russia's benefiting. The Gulf countries take a big hit in terms of infrastructure and revenue, but that gives them leverage in other ways, which we're going to be covering today when you follow the money. And so they take a hit temporarily, but they get what they want on the medium term, and they're hedged on the short term slightly. And those that are playing the game the best get to restructure power amongst OPEC. And OPEC consists of Russia, Saudi, the GCC, and various other countries as well. And so that's on the side of like the trade negotiations. Now, China has the largest reserves of everything: rare earths, all the different components, metals, oil, energy, all the alternative energy, solar, wind, hydro, every type of energy they're building out. And anyone that's going and transitioning to renewables, the FIC will have portfolio companies that benefit from that. You use ESG, and then you use the crisis. They tried climate change before. Now, instead, they can use a global reset energy crisis in order to get that rebuilding of manufacture. And then there is the almighty disruption, which is nuclear, which is why Germany had to turn off its nukes, because these were operations. And it's why Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. And it's why we're getting lots of infrastructure around energy being blown up to keep those prices up in order to change the leverage in these renegotiations and to transition this world into multipolarity, while the TIC build their one world government, police and surveillance state, CBDCs, stable coins, artificial intelligence, social credit scores, and pre-crime arrests, which requires civil unrest. But the rebuild contracts will be done by FIC, the sovereign wealth funds, and it also, China has its Belt and Road Initiative. So it has been selling its treasuries from 1.4 trillion to about 650 billion, buying gold, investing in the Belt and Road Initiative, and buying oil and energy so that it was ready for everything. So it can hold out for as long as this needs to be, but they don't want oil prices to get so bad, like $200, that it blows up everything and creates problems. So they're managing the prices in a managed transition. And that managed transition gives enough time to effectively build the multipolar world, concentrate all the wealth upwards, have a lot of bankruptcies and supply chain issues, and then also, rebuild in terms of the pools of capital and transnational capital. Now, what's really important is the payment system and the payment rails, which is we're going to be focusing on the currency war today. But it's basically built in the West, we have a Fed-led monetary system. In the right, there was the alternative SIPs. Then stablecoins and CBDCs created alternative independent rails. And then you had the exits of sovereign wealth, which is gold and Bitcoin in self-custody. In terms of Bitcoin in custody, that helps FIC. Bitcoin in self-custody, that allows you to fight back and resist against FIC, as gold does in self-custody. If you're putting it in custody, you help the custodian. Now, there is major changes in terms of where that gold is being custodied, and we're going to be going through that as well. And that's what it's really important to understand. But in the West, we're following the World Economic Forum private corporate interest agenda. That is the business interest that has BlackRock and Larry Fink as the interim board. On the Middle Eastern side and the Eastern side, we've got OPEC, which is the big cartel, and then we've got the power of the CCP, which doesn't have any company subordinate to it, but it has its almighty export and alternative rails that it has been building. And those are the real powers. And I believe that they coordinate in order to reset the map in line with real power dynamics. And they manage it through capital flows, which has always been the model, by the way. The British had the British East India Company and the Bank of England. The Dutch created the bond market, stock market. the Amsterdam Central Bank, and then the Dutch East India Company. And then we transitioned to the Federal Reserve System, which had different iterations. We went from a gold standard to an IMF-led Federal Reserve gold standard, where everyone went into free currencies. And then when that bankrupted at the Vietnamese War, we went into the petrodollar. And the petrodollar is effectively being renegotiated right now through this energy reset and global reset, which leads the Fed to, the Fed to asset stripping all the lost assets as we manage this transition. And Trump is like the press secretary. Trump is FIC aligned. His job is to get rich by executing this as effectively the front-facing president of the current, American empire. But everything is for fick, mick, and tick. And his job is just to create a narrative to make it look like it's something different, and then extract enough personal wealth in order to be incentivized to carry on. And then he leaves, and we move over to the next puppet, maybe J.D. Vance. But any world leaders that is effectively not on board with transnational capital is at the risk of regime change. We're probably lining up for Cuba next. We had Venezuela. We had the operation within Iran. Cuba is the next thing. We had a regime change within Hungary as well, interestingly, because that was the holdout vote for the European Union. Now, the Bank for International Settlements created the European Union. The Hungarian was effectively selling his vote to Israel to enact MIC type of operations, as well as Russia, which was, holding back the sanctions to invest in MIC. And so Bank for International Settlements in the EU, they're aligned with military-industrial complex. And we're having within Germany, which is effectively being rebuilt as an alternative MIC, rel, as the traditional MIC that was aligned with the US is leaving and hedging. Okay, so on the front end of this, we think we're all talking about nuclear energy. We think we're all talking about, asymmetric warfare. We all think we're talking about, countries for their survival, America first, Europe first, UK first. We're playing the left and right game. We think that, they want us distracted with a completely different type of game. And they're also doing a lot of psychological warfare, flooding us with information so that we have low attention spans, watching 1-minute TikTok videos, always adjusting to whatever they throw us, and galvanizing us into an extremist version of our ideology, whether it be far right, whether it be radical left, whether it be Zionism, whether it be resistance, whatever it may be. They want you extreme so that even if they don't get the civil unrest, they can just do the color revolutions that they've been doing globally, like the American and British Empire have been doing ever since for 400 years, the European empires and the American empire. All of that is coming home now in a multipolar world. And so this northern hemisphere is being built, as well as China effectively having all these different regional blocks that are being defined through these energy renegotiations. Now, we're led, as this is all happening, granted, is probably going to take much longer than I thought. That's the bit I didn't get right. But directionally, I think we're still headed in the exact right direction. And as it becomes apparent what they're doing, I'm able to follow the money and update you each week with where I think it goes next. But the end result is still the same, which is a weaker Israel, Iran that's vassalized into Israel that's vassalized into the GCC, Iran that's effectively vassalized into BRICS, and the FIC full control takeover of the West. More and more of that, and more dependency of the people with these higher and higher prices in this K-shaped economy. But we're led to believe that there are negotiations that are failing, and we're going to enter into another forever war. And that we're still in the US hegemon model. That is the case in the Northern Hemisphere for Europe and Central and South America. But the Middle East, I believe, is transitioning to regional stability. And that involves changing everything. And those changes is what we're witnessing right now. Now, we're led to believe that ceasefire negotiations are breaking down. I believe these are check-ins towards strategic operations that are directionally are leading to this transnational capital and FIC video. So with that in mind, let's take a little bit of a break. Like last week, I like to break up these videos with a bit of the really funny right now Iranian propaganda that is being released. So let's have a look at the negotiations and I'll be right back to cover the rest. And we're going to be covering what effectively changed this week that allows us to analyze the currency war side. So we'll take a quick break.
We are having very great negotiations with Iran. If Iran doesn't come to negotiate, we're going to bomb them.
2,000 years later.
So where are the Iranians?
This is from Iran.
All right. Then I will extend the ceasefire at Pakistan's request.
Okay, so let's look at Iran war week 8. What changed this week and what do we need to know? So firstly, apparently we've entered into a new phase. So by quick reminder, every time oil prices and bond prices hit a certain point, Trump creates a new theater. That theater lets you have 48 hours to decide we're going to have a nuclear war. We're going to have civilian casualty. People think he's gone crazy, all that type of stuff. All the magatards say, yeah, Trump's kicking ass. He rules the world. Everyone creates their own narrative based upon whatever they want this to be for them. But we were in a 2-week ceasefire, which was effectively between the 7th and the 8th of April was the announcement. And then we entered into the end of that. Now, leading up to that, there's going to be meetings in Islamabad, and there was a lot of back and forth, and there was, we're turning up, we're not turning up, all that type of stuff. But right before the final hour on Taco Tuesday this week, we had what Trump called an indefinite ceasefire extension. That happened on April the 21st, and it was an announcement on Truth Social, which effectively said we are in an indefinite ceasefire and there's an extension and there's no new deadline. To me, this means that there is negotiations are going to take longer than thought. And the negotiations were happening way before, during, and they'll continue happening after because there's a major change, as I covered already. But there are different factions of power that are having those negotiations. Now, we had conflicting messages. On one side, we were having this war's escalating, it's going to the next level, it's going to be a huge forever war. But at the same time, there were lots of flights that were resumed across the Middle East. So we had the Gulf countries resuming flights. There were flights resumed between Iran and China, and then China and the Gulf, and between the Gulf. And so that was a bit of a confusing message. Now, either that was theatrics, or they were resuming them, knowing that that there's going to be no additional kinetics at the stage, or they were doing it to get ahead. But we were told that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Remember, we had the blockade of the blockade. So in order to get a shipment through in a blockade of a blockade, you need insurance. That insurance comes from Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London will say, can you give me guarantees that the IRGC won't shoot you down? And can you now give me guarantees that the US Navy won't shoot you down? And so you need to provide those guarantees in order to get insurance, which means it's closed. But if you are a nation state, or you are on the right side of Lloyd's of London, the IRGC and US, like India is, like China is, then you're probably able to get a shipment through. And so people will use their leverage, and there has been shipments throughout. And so while we are getting the global reset of the repricing of all commodities, those that really have the leverage are able to get their shipments through. So this week, even though we were told it was a complete blockade, and that America was going to be shutting off all of Iran's oil and shipments to China, we had effectively 40 shipments still passing the blockade. Now, did all they get insurance from Lloyd's of London and permission from America and permission from IRGC? Well, they got through. You either take the risk, and most people would not take that risk with their commercial cargoes, but maybe for oil. Now, remember, you can't shoot down an oil tanker because it will destroy all of the allies in the region. So there's a very theatrical element to this. And US is now saying, we've got the blockade, Iran's taken out, we've taken out the Navy, yet there was only 3 boarded US Navy ships that went on to Iranian ships, made it, you got the Hollywood movie, and yet there was, at least one retaliation by Iran, and yet the U.S. facing narrative is that the blockade is enforced, but there was a retaliation. Now that retaliation means that even if U.S. or Iran want to give those guarantees, there's cases where it doesn't work anyway. So Lloyd's of London won't be insuring, and so this is a financial industrial complex alongside different factions of the MiC that are involved here. And those that benefit from it. So there was one Iranian that was intercepted by the Navy, and that escalated after the 3. So we've got two-way sides of this blockade, leading to things that wouldn't get you your insurance. Now, this week we've had greater than 26 Iranian vessels that have bypassed the restrictions. So it's not the case that Iran is shut off. They're still trading. Their largest trading partners are China and UAE. There was a large US military asset buildup that is happening right now. So that's leading to a belief that there will be a resumption of operations. Now, are those operations in Lebanon? Are they on some of the islands in the Strait of Hormuz? Is it a ground invasion? Well, you know the game here if you've been watching. In order to have a ground invasion, you need over 1 million troops. So nothing we're seeing is occupation of Iran, taking over the oil, and then pricing it in dollar as like a MAGA narrative and shutting off China and making America dominate the world. That's not happening. In terms of taking over of some of the islands, there are 2 different types of islands. There's Karg Island, sorry if I'm not saying that correctly, where Iran exports over like 90% of all its oil, but it has alternative routes. So it will push the price up, it won't stop it. But that might be a theatrical Hollywood movie end negotiation in order to justify why we can get to where I think we're getting in the end, which is the removal of sanctions and the opening up of Iran to the global economies. And what implications that has when you have another 3 to 4 barrels of oil that are no longer sold at a discount to China, but are now sold at the prevailing price to anybody outside of sanctions. That's an important thing that's being negotiated behind the scene. But none of what we're seeing is enough to actually do a full invasion of Iran. And we did see that there was an attempt. Remember I said we're looking for a Hollywood movie? Well, there was a rescue operation that many people analyzed and said, no, that was a failed ground invasion to take highly enriched uranium, a bit like the B-2 bomber that led to the end of the 12-day war, where you can just pretend the Iranian program's over and everyone gets their exit narrative, and things move on. Now, we may get another one of those, but we've got nowhere near enough people and it would be a suicide mission. All of these involve real death, but they've never cared. And if you think they care, like the military industrial complex cared, then you don't know history, because this is about, the Build Back Better model, as I've always said. Military profits, financial rebuild, police and surveillance state, tech industrial complex. So there's not enough to invade Iran. So what are we getting? Well, there is also, and I want to introduce this now because UAE came up a lot. Remember, UAE is the second largest trade partner of Iran. It also provides the sanction circumvention mechanisms for Iran. It also has a dispute with Iran in terms of 3 islands in the Strait of Hormuz. That's quite interesting. Maybe there is something that's been negotiated behind the scenes. And as we'll be covering today in the US a currency war side, there was an FX swap operation that everybody translated incorrectly. And I'm going to be going through it and its significance today. So what have we had build up? Well, anyway, there is a USS George Bush that is set to arrive, and maybe that will arrive today or this weekend. But it seems like it's going to arrive in time for market close. We know that Trump likes to do these escalations when the market is closed and then taco on the Tuesday. Have the market correction, do market manipulation on Monday, taco Tuesday, escalation over the weekend. That's been what's been happening time and time again. And so we are leading into market close when that will arrive. I'm not sure whether they're going to do something this weekend or it's going to be next week, but they are setting up that game again. There's also a buildup of KC tankers and cargo ships that are all coming along. Fighter jets have arrived in the Qatar airbase, and the same is happening in the US Jordan airbase as well. So that implies that there is either additional decapitation campaigns in Iran via the flights. There is something that may be happening in Lebanon. Remember, I said that's the final negotiation chip. Again, humanitarian crisis. It is disgusting what's happening in Lebanon. People are being displaced, civilian, deaths. Effectively, Gaza 2.0 in a certain part of Lebanon. And threats of occupation, Greater Israel Project, all the same things we're used to when you analyze from the traditional humanitarian side. And we're getting the same kind of build up within Israel. So it looks like we're getting towards that final thing, which is, remember I said, they solved Yemen and the Houthis with a Saudi agreement. They solved Iraq and Syria with regime change, and less support from Iran while US troops exit. And we've had the border peace and the Hamas settlement within Gaza. So now there's only Hezbollah and Lebanon left. And that's the final thing. And we started to see escalation around there. So we had an announcement from Trump that they will be supporting the Lebanese army, which has always been funded by US covert operations. And the financial crisis in Lebanon and the currency war has always been done by the IMF, and supporting the Lebanese government, which is very sectarian. Some of it is Christian, some of it is Muslim, some of it is Shia, some of it is Sunni, and so is the army there as well, and Hezbollah as well. So it looks like, we've had lots of civil wars and destabilization campaigns within Lebanon as well. I personally believe that this is a managed transition to eventually integrate Hezbollah into the army, into the political process, and then you have an integration with Lebanon into the GCC corridor, in exchange for sanction relief that Iran will then open up its markets in the regional stability model that I've always covered. But in the meantime, we're getting all of the usual narratives as well. To understand the game in Lebanon, it's always been when there's a ground invasion by Israel, Hezbollah kicks ass. When they do air domination and bomb, they create lots of civilian targets. And there's not a lot that Hezbollah can do, and Israel dominates there. Is there a hybrid model with this build up with US and Israel? Well, we'll see. But this will lead to, I believe, escalate to de-escalate, ceasefire negotiation. And we're currently in a 3-week ceasefire, which has been violated periodically. Nothing new there. It's always what Israel does. It starts killing journalists, it goes after civilian targets, and it starts destroying the buildings for the rebuild projects, for the alternative pipelines, for the alternative infrastructure routes that they want to rebuild. And Lockheed Martin gets massive orders, I think about $67 billion, because America's running out of its munitions. So Lockheed Martin gets its stimulus check. The financial industrial complex gets its rebuild and profit from war checks. And of course, as we can see in the Gaza border peace plan, there's a whole element of technocratic police and surveillance state to it as well. All powered by AI and nuclear energy in the new vision as well. But anyway, what we're being told is that these replenishments, because America has drained so much of their munitions, will take approximately 4 years to fulfill those orders. So there's no quick solution here. This is turning over of US national security for the profits of the military. So this is weakening the military while it gets additional orders, while it extracts those resources for foreign interests and transnational capital, dumping the debt on the American people and protecting the stock markets and bond markets at all costs. So I'll be going through those flows as well. But what does it do as well? Who's getting distressed? Well, South Korea. That is part of the semiconductor chip manufacturing industry. Japan will be in stress as well, part of the robotics manufacturing industry, as well as military rebuild contracts. Taiwan, essential part of the semiconductor manufacturing industry. The GCC, they're having stress as well as the European Union. And those are all the most impacted. So they need to renegotiate into the powers, the financial industrial complex and China's Belt and Road Initiative. That sets up those hemispheres of multipolarity. All are going to face, basically renegotiation with China, with the BRICS corridors, and FX swap lines via the Federal Reserve with the US. And I want to make sure you understand that, because it was kind of pitched as a UAE bailout. UAE has got $271 billion of reserves and trillions of dollars of assets. But those assets consist of US treasuries as well as US equities. That was the leverage. And that rolled out. We'll be going through that as well. But anyway, they created the environment of an escalation narrative that spikes the price of oil to get these high prices, which is manufacturing the global reset. We get the supply chain issues, but then suddenly it stabilizes so it doesn't get too bad. Now, we still have, over the next 3 to 6 months, all of those supply chain issues. Don't think we're out of the market because the stock markets are at new all-time highs. We still need to get to the big print. We still need to face those supply chain issues, and there will be demand destruction in a recession. But publicly, the talks between Iran and US paused. But privately, in my opinion, we still continued. And so what were they negotiating? Well, publicly, it's about nuclear enrichment and nuclear program. That's been the narrative for 40 years. That's the public-facing narrative that always gives the justification for war, military budget to Israel, the supporting of resistance, and that strategic tension between Iran and Israel that never leads to a war until the 12-day war as well. We've seen no action from the Houthis, which would create the disaster. And maybe that's the final scene, but we haven't seen that because the agreements with Saudi have held. We've had constant threats that they're going to come back again and close the Red Sea. But if you close the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, I think that's too much of an issue. So the Saudi deal is holding for now. And I believe they'll be negotiating their integration strategy, or whatever it may be. Now, Iran and Iraq, we've had the troops leaving, as well as the Iranian escalation that's led to the rebuild contracts within Iran, severe damage to lots of infrastructure, which gives basically a head start to the countries that are selling their oil and are able to get their flows right now. Russia and the private corporate interest in the FIC as well. Gaza ceasefire has so far held by Hamas. Nothing changed over there. But Hezbollah has been the final battle. So we've had that weakening of Israel via Hezbollah and weakening of Hezbollah via Israel. And so far on the ground invasion, Hezbollah has dominated, but we've had massive, infrastructure and civilian casualties and Hezbollah damages from the air as well. So that led to the framework of a settlement, and now we get to what I think the end game is. We're going to see that. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. It's already taken longer than I thought, but that's the same with everything, really. So at the same time, what have we had? We've had a massive currency war. So let me set up the parameters and the understanding, because most people don't fully appreciate the flows. So there is 3 to 4 million barrels per day that would come online at full price if Iranian sanctions are lifted. That's a pretty big deal, because prior it was sold at a discount to China. Now, Iran also has $100 billion sanctioned. That's a significant portion of their GDP. They also have had this trade narrative build where they said we could charge on the Strait of Hormuz that would lead to investment in the infrastructure as reparations. That lays the framework for trade sanction relief. And then we're talking on off around nuclear enrichment and ballistic missile program. But we've got all these major oil negotiations that I think have to happen in the background. So what is really important, I always said, is the price of oil is the equity markets and there's the bond markets that lead to the capitulation. Anytime you get a crash in the stock market, anytime you get yields on the 10 and 30-year yield at 4.5% and 5%, and oil prices above 115 on the 1 month Brent futures. Now, those are the real points. Those are the extraction, the asset stripping, the K-shaped economy. That has to continue. Stock market has to go up. Bond yields can't go out of control because that affects the mortgage market, which affects banking, but eventually it can. So you can have those roll out that leads to increases in bond purchase, bond yields. So as bond prices go down because people are selling, bond yields go up. And then you get higher mortgages, refinancing, auto loans and credit cards and everything from there. Now that leads to the narrative for the big print and bailout, where the Fed can purchase those bonds to get the rates down. And that's what's needed. This is the asset extraction, big print, rollover. You also need an AI narrative, China for national security narrative. China's winning the AI race. At these energy prices, our AI companies are in distress. They are a massive chunk of the stock market. So we must create jobs by getting people to build AI and robotics and data centers. And in the interest of national security, we must win the AI race. That is the justification for the big print and the narrative that I think we're leading up to. And obviously, who benefits from that? TIC and FIC as well. But what do you need to sacrifice in order to do that? You need to sacrifice the value of the dollar, because you're diluting the dollar, which is at the end of the war. Once you start doing that in the big print, you start weakening the dollar again. And we already saw that DXY, the dollar has started going below that $100 mark, down to 98. At its low was 96 prior to this war. So that's starting to happen again. But what other currencies are outperforming it? The Chinese yuan, and any currency connected to commodities, whether it be Brazil, whether it be, those other, commodity led things. So those are outperforming, and we got to return to gold as well. And we got to return to Bitcoin. So dollars denominated in Bitcoin, gold, commodity, connected currencies, and the manufacturing base, the Chinese yuan, the Swiss franc, these countries are outperforming the dollar, and everyone else is underperforming the dollar. So that is telling you about the capital flows. So the world reserve currency is being renegotiated. When you strengthen the Chinese yuan and weaken the dollar relative to each other, and gold purchases are going up, then you're sacrificing and doing the managed transition of the world reserve currency using fiscal dominance, big print, massive stimulus checks, to the corporate class, obviously, the shareholder class, not the average American. So you're effectively sacrificing the currency for the bond market, because you're asking the Fed to do yield control. You're rolling over the debt so that more and more bonds are issued, and you're not allowing anyone to sell their bonds in order to purchase oil if their country's in distress, like Japan is right now. And instead, you're giving them loans, FX swap lines. What does that mean? rather than them selling equity. So rather than UAE, which owns like $1 trillion of equity, rather than them selling that and crashing the stock market, or selling their bonds, which would push yields up and create distress in the banking market, they get access to the FX swap market, which means that they can deposit their currency and get dollars. And those dollars come from the reserves of, the FX foreign exchange stabilization funds, or even the TGA, the Treasury General Account, or maybe even additional money printing. And so effectively, foreign countries can print dollars through these currency FX swap. And the ones that get access continually, like Japan, they get to be integrated into the future financial system, where you can hold the American bond market to hostage by threatening to sell your bonds. And the same with equities as well. So this is exactly what happened. And UAE decided to take this opportunity in order to get an FX swap line. Now, if this leads to a longer term agreement, it bolsters them as a financial system after all this stress, because this has been a bad situation for their reputation, rebuilds it where, backstopped by dollars, and you being able to print dollars, which weakens the dollar in terms of the fiscal dominance trade. You also get your financial system becomes a part of transnational capital as well. And this allows hedging of financial rails in countries that are connected to Enbridge central bank digital currencies and China's SIP system, which effectively puts them in the middle of the petrodollar and the petro-yuan, something that was reserved for Saudi only. Now, if Iran gets that too, you now have 3 rails, maybe Qatar as well, maybe Oman asks for it. So this is the implication. This is FIC diversifying and negotiating military contracts, not for forever war, but for genuine defense, which will be hedged by China, Russia, and local regional agreements. That changes everything. It changes absolutely everything. What else happened this week? Coincidentally, we had $3.5 billion worth of Tether frozen. And so if people were thinking of transitioning to the American stablecoin standard, rather than the CBDC Enbridge project and dollarizing, you got an example of why you shouldn't do that, because they can be frozen. And we also had $13 billion of exits on DeFi contracts, which led to $1 billion of flows into Bitcoin ETFs and Bitcoin in self-custody. So the crypto market started to feel stress. We had freeze functions across many of the crypto contracts. Anthropic, layer 2s. Layer 1s where effectively DeFi contracts started breaking. We had massive pulling of contracts. We had reversal of smart contracts. We had hacking of smart contracts. And that drove everyone into Bitcoin in self-custody, as well as having freezing of stable coins. So this was effectively an attack on the DeFi crypto space, an attack on stable coins, why people shouldn't use them or know what they're getting into. The movement towards trying to centralize Bitcoin into the ETFs, but the Bitcoin in self-custody was the safe haven, was the sovereign exit, was the protection. Because there's no, you don't have all these crazy smart contracts on top of Bitcoin. So all of this started happening at the same time, as well as the price of gold going up, where central banks were announcing that they've increased their gold holdings again. And then UAE threatened or leaked to the press, didn't threat directly, which is normally on purpose, that they will do a Yuan oil deal in terms of their pricing if they can't get access to their FX swap lines. Or they'll sell their bonds, or they'll sell their equity. And Scott Bessent had to capitulate. And Saudi will watch that. Oman will watch that. Iran will watch that. And that was Qatar will watch that. Other countries, we saw that, and this is a less risky model because many of those countries have pegged their currency to the dollar, which means that they have to protect the dollar. So they have to sell their gold or have to sell their equities or have to sell their treasuries to maintain that peg. But if they can get an FX swap line, they're integrated into the dollar system without subordination to the dollar system, which was the old colonization model. This is a gradual managed transition. Europe, now who had those FX swap lines? The European Central Bank, the Swiss Central Bank, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of Japan, and that was an exclusive club. No Gulf country has ever had one of those lines. Now, the countries that needed the bailout, they got temporary lines, like Argentina. And that was with currency risk and IMF and all subordination strategy. But it's always a temporary, because if you issue dollars and you take the Argentinian peso, that's a massive risky trade. But taking a currency that's pegged to the dollar is a completely different risk profile. So this may be a permanent fixture. And I'm guessing it will be. I'll keep watching that as well. So Europe is beginning to effectively roll out the bans on all the different imports on Russian LNG. So that means that it's going to be buying the LNG from Cheniere Energy and Golden Pass. And then eventually it can go back into its Qatar and Strait of Hormuz relationship, but not until it's fully subordinated into FIC further. And that can go through a recession, distressed acquisitions, and the soaking up of all the different assets that BlackRock is doing across Europe, across UK, and then building out those alternative where the countries come fully subordinate. There's no agenda for the people. There's just wealth extraction. This is not just chaos. This is definitely global capital repricing and restructuring at this point. So what is the real shift? Effectively, we're moving from eventually missiles in the Middle East and Iran, ships, and the big shipment operations, airspace, and maybe we have a final round, escalate to de-escalate, final last words. It seems like this is a longer operation to get all these things through. To payment rails being renegotiated, to settlement systems for oil and for different assets, and the integration into reserve assets and the different payment systems and payment rails. This is now currency war. Now, what is happening in terms of the flows? You saw a lot of talk about gold repatriating eastwards away from westwards. How does that actually happen? Well, when you're integrating into the Yuan and the 110 countries and payment systems like India did, like Russia did, like Iran did as well, you don't want Yuan, and China is very selective over their currency. They have capital controls. They don't want the corporate takeover by FIC that America's had happening to them. So they have the CCP, and the FIC is subordinate. It's state banking, PBOC, and capital controls. And so that doesn't make world reserve currency. The dollar does, but you don't want it strengthening. You want it weakening in order to manage these capital outflows. And that shrinks it to a regional power, but you utilize the rails. And so in a multipolar, you can have it where things are priced in dollars but settled in local currencies. So how does China do it? Effectively via gold. And so what tends to happen is if you're exporting your gold, your oil, like Russia or like Russia is or Iran is, you effectively pay in gold, which can then be converted into yuan, which then can be used to purchase oil. And the mechanics of how that works, I'm going to cover after a quick break. And so let's go through another AI video, and then I want to help you understand this problem so that we can start to think about the flows and how that impacts the paper gold market and paper Bitcoin market, which structurally is a scam because it doesn't have enough gold in order to back it. And so that is the transition, which I think we need to keep an eye on. All of that's going to be coming in the next section. Let's take a quick break with some of the Iranian propaganda Lego videos.
not gonna.
Yeah, cash with the tail name on the badge. Talk big boy, now stuck in the act. Said burn it down, said clear fast. Now you run what you used to trash. Built that image, sold that fight. Camera hit, you lost that light. All that talk don't hold that weight. Flow real quick when it's high stakes.
Bang, bang, better ram, hit the door. Drunk, you laid on the floor.
Yeah.
Bang, bang, hear the sound, break it down.
Break down.
Built it up just to lose it now.
Late night spin, can't stand straight. Just not too damn late. Knock, 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 still no reply. Top seat silent. Wonder why. Bring the ram, break that frame. Top of power, still the same. Unreachable when it counts the most. Playing leader, acting ghost. Nashville lights, but the voice ain't there. Stage look loud, but the crowd don't care. Auto-tune dreams, no real tone. Dead crowd stay all on they phone. You fund the flights, push that show, but the streams stay flat. Don't bro, country act, but it don't feel right. More like dress up on the stage light.
You said you'd take it all down. Now you're lost in the sound. You said you stand your ground. Now you're falling right now.
USA ice, real one skate. Take real hits, play real fake. You on thin ice, lose that pace. Slide right out, can't hold your place.
Bang, bang, battering ram, hit the door.
Cash.
Drunk, you laid on the floor.
Yeah.
Bang, bang, hear the sound, break it down.
Back down.
Built it up, now we're breaking down. Bang, 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 bang. Echo the hall. You went up, now you fall.
Okay, so let's take a look at the gold yuan oil mechanism. So what's the problem? The problem is that countries, they don't earn Chinese yuan, and they need to buy goods from China, and China's a net exporter. So whenever you want to buy goods, you need some yuan, and you don't have any. So what is the solution for that? Well, what countries like Russia and Iran have been doing is effectively they buy gold with their dollars. So there's a deep liquid market for dollars to gold. And then you can send that gold to Shanghai, because Shanghai has a deep gold custody service. And once you send that gold, so effectively you're circumventing payment systems there, you can take your dollars, you can buy some gold, you send that gold to Shanghai, and then you receive some yuan on the other side with the custodian. But then that yuan is deposited with an account with PBOC or with a Chinese bank. And then you can use that yuan in order to buy goods, and then you're integrated into the Chinese payment system, SIPS. And so, or you could even, if you're Russia and Iran, because the sanction restriction is actually on the payment method, you can actually do a barter trade, and you can take that account and you can send some oil, and you can get through this way. And so this is effectively the alternative payment rails that China has set up. But it also means, what does it mean? They can print yuan, but they can't print gold. They can print yuan, but they can't print oil. And so they end up with gold in Shanghai, and that system is actually a real custody system. They're not issuing derivatives as well. They're not creating, gold derivatives and having the massive leveraged paper market that happens or historically happened in London and New York. And so through this mechanism, effectively, Iran can sell oil for gold using yuan, and that can all happen within the middle. And then Iran can then offer imports, or they can start to receive those imports from China. And all you need to do is pass the blockade in order to allow that transaction to happen. And so why does this actually matter if there is a blockade? And so that's kind of why you can imagine that blockade is there. So China is not attacking the dollar directly because China doesn't want to have world reserve currency. It just wants to trade. It just wants to export, and it wants capital controls. It's not doing what the Federal Reserve System is, which is exporting debt in a dollar Ponzi scheme. And so it's not really attacking the dollar. And even though right now the Chinese yuan is strengthening relative to the dollar, it's kind of attacking it indirectly by actually having the gold and the real commodities. So it's basically, imagine that the London system and the New York system has structurally got paper gold that's not backed by gold. And just like the fractional reserve banking system, it relies upon people not wanting their gold. But the Chinese yuan system means that you have to pay with gold in order to get Chinese yuan, and you do that via the dollar mechanism. Well, through this whole thing, you end up with China and Shanghai being the largest custodian of gold, while the PBOC is continually buying gold as well through this mechanism, and end up transferring as much of gold through your exports. And it's really draining the gold that is the backing of the paper system in the West. And so what you're really doing is you're draining the gold that sits underneath the paper system in the West, which means that there's less gold backing it. And as you have less and less gold backing it, whenever you enter into an event where people don't want their paper gold anymore and they want their real gold and they need to take delivery, the system shuts down. And we saw this during COVID. But the net effect is that the gold ends up leaving London and leaving New York and leaving US or Texas or wherever it's stored, based upon the paper system. And whenever the paper system weakens, you get these structural movements. And this happened with JP Morgan during the silver squeeze. And you keep having these events where you limit your exports, and that creates a shock in the commodity market. We saw this with silver, we saw this with gold. And through this system of exporting, you end up with more gold draining from the West and over to the East. And so China is effectively accumulating reserves and storing more and more of its gold in custody, and using the Shanghai system in order to accumulate more and more gold, while the West, which is ultra financialized and securitized, accumulates more paper. And those paper versions of gold and those derivative contracts mean that the system gets more and more extractive. So transnational capital over time can effectively, through the Federal Reserve System and through this gold mechanism, can choose to rug pull the Federal Reserve System whenever it wants to, if it wants to. So if for any reason the socializing the losses and privatizing of the gains weren't to happen, there's always this structural rug pull underneath it. And you test the system further and further and further. And the West gets more and more leveraged, and the East gets more and more gold back. And then they did the same with Bitcoin. They effectively created in the West, BlackRock, the Bitcoin financial industrial complex that I've been warning against. Bitcoin treasury companies, Bitcoin-backed loans, Bitcoin ETFs. And if you haven't watched my video on my blog where I went through how Jane Street takes advantage of those settlement layers between the time you need to accumulate the Bitcoin versus issue the shares, it creates this mechanism for manipulating the price short term. But long term, you can't manipulate the price, because eventually you end up in a scenario where people want the underlying assets. And this is the whole concept and the whole risk in the system, that there is structurally more paper and claims on gold than there is gold. And the further and further this goes, the worse it gets, until eventually you have a systemic risk event where people realize, and there was books written like The Great Taking, where how this applies to the equity markets. DTCC is the clearinghouse, the brokers own the gold. They have the ability to, when you think you own your shares, the broker owns the shares and DCC has a claim over it. But who actually has the shares? The custodian. So BlackRock, through this mechanism and through the custodians, could end up with what's called a great taking. There was a book written on it. You can check it out on YouTube. But this whole concept of you can use big print that leads into great takings, but you keep the system for as long as you can through the big prints. And so you keep extracting, you keep pushing the K-shaped economy. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. But effectively, through this mechanism of trade in these global institutions, the gold ends up in Shanghai to greater and greater degrees, and the backing in London and New York gets worse and worse and worse. And this is why I've always said to people, gold in self-custody, Bitcoin in self-custody, opt out. You don't need to worry about any of that stuff. You can just sit back and watch it happen. But the yuan effectively gains settlement leverage and relevance as well through this system. And so the West's response is effectively paper gold is not backed by the physical, but they try and make it inconvenient for you to get the physical, which is why they innovate exchange traded funds and ETFs, which is why they come up with ever more derivative products, and they create more and more synthetic gold, fake gold, representations of gold. Your pension's full of it, but it's not at the custodian. That is, kind of the system working as it was designed. And whenever the system gets stressed, and we saw that during COVID, you effectively lend the gold from the central bank. And so this is the mechanism of why there's never an audit of the Fed and Treasury. Remember, during the Great Depression, there was a great taking of all the Americans' gold. It ended up at Fort Knox, and it sat on the Treasury's balance sheet. Now, through this central banking mechanism and through investment banks creating more and more paper gold, every time there was stress and people couldn't get their gold, you could get a loan from the central bank. And so it would then sit on both the Treasury's balance sheet and the Fed's balance sheet. And it's a scam. They historically just removed the gold standard like they did in 71 when you need more and more debt financing, where people can't exchange their gold. But that hasn't gone away. And so all they're doing is buying time. And that's how the Western system is structured. It is buying time because the gold's not there, the silver's not there. And whenever you have those big events where people need to hedge and you have the short squeeze, like we did in silver just before 2024 Christmas, 2025 Christmas, you're basically buying time and not stopping the shift if you can find another ETF, another synthetic gold, and another derivative contract. And that is the ticking time bomb, just like FDIC in the West, the Federal Deposit Insurance, can only insure 1% of all the deposits. So if any more globally systemic banks go bust at the same time, the Fed bails out, which is socializing losses, privatizing the gains. Same happens in all of these markets. And that is getting structurally more and more risky and more concentrated. And where are people sending their gold, their actual gold? Well, it's going to Singapore. It's in Switzerland. It's going to Shanghai. But the leverage is still in London. And that's why with Argentina, remember, they got their FX swap. You got the bond scam and wealth extraction under Milei, but the gold ended up in Rothschild & Co. in London because they needed it. And more was expatriating out of the Bank of England, out of America and into Shanghai when you had these things. So this is kind of the same story for Bitcoin in custody. You can do that in reverse. And now, what happens when you know that? So you know there's not enough gold and commodities and silver. You also know that the shares are held under the custody relationship in a great taking. You know that a big print can always socialize the losses and privatize the gains. You also know that $69 trillion of assets are owned offshore and overseas. And you know that if you sell American treasuries, it weakens the price, puts up interest rate, and therefore the Fed has to bail out and socialize the losses. So the financial industrial complex is just milking and extracting and extracting and extracting. But also, you're a foreign country and you know that you've got a lot of equity. What happened? Foreign direct investment stopped buying US Treasury bonds, the petrodollar, Saudi, and started buying US equity and AI companies. But now you can't sell the equity because they can't have the stock market crash because it lays the collateral for a lot of these debt and derivative instruments. So you've leveraged up the equity market, you've leveraged up the bond market, you've leveraged up the commodity markets. You have an oil shock. And the only way to solve, the only thing you can print is dollars. But what if the dollar is structurally weakening and having a managed transition relative to other commodity-backed currencies? And what if people try to sell their treasuries because foreigners need to buy oil, like Japan, like Taiwan, like Europe? You have to give them dollar swap lines. And so that means that you effectively negotiate your country creating dollars based upon having the ability to print your own currency, and you have leverage. And so this is exactly what happened with UAE. The UAE, basically this week, the US cannot allow the selling of equity, and they cannot allow the selling of bonds by foreign investors, and Iran knows that. And that's why transnational capital and closure of Strait of Hormuz is the global reset. So what actually happened? So, okay, let's look through this. So Iran starts firing at US assets in the Middle East. And one of those is UAE. And UAE gets hit harder. UAE has a financial system of tourism, finance, and then oil. But through this mechanism, Iran starts firing at the UAE. The UAE tourists start to leave. You have retail selling their real estate, people deciding, is finance haven? And who buys all those assets on the cheap? Well, institutional investors, BlackRock. And so the UAE gets, the institutional investors get a bunch of assets on the cheap. They get to vassalize UAE further into their leverage position within the GCC. They already have a bunch of dollar reserves, but they say to the US, we're going to sell some of our treasuries to, meet some of these demands. We also saw that people were selling their gold to buy Bitcoin as they were leaving, because UAE has massive gold markets and has also got large Bitcoin and crypto markets. We saw that UAE started sanctioning some of the paper assets. We had the confiscation of stable coins. People were then selling their gold in order to buy Bitcoin to leave UAE. We had effectively a threat to sell treasuries in order to, capitalize up their banking system, because they gave guarantees to small businesses that needed any of those dollars or any of those local currency. They can't sell their oil, so they start depleting their dollar reserves, because the Strait of Hormuz is reduced the amount of oil that they're selling significantly. But they can print their own currency. So basically, the UAE went to the US and said, give us a swap line. And Scott Bessent had to say yes. Because the threat was, the leak said we'll price oil in Yuan, which means that more gold's going to end up in China. And they start to control the petro-yuan system as well, like Saudi has done part of it. And the US response was we'll provide some liquidity. We'll give you an FX swap line. And so they say, you print some of your currency, some dirhams. You then deposit it with us, and we'll give you some dollars and you get a rate. And your system is backed by the dollar system. And so you get to effectively become like the Japan carry trade in terms of the financial services that you can build on top of it. It adds more risk to the US system and more foreign control. And so foreigners can say, I'm not going to sell my equities, I'm not going to sell my bonds, but you need to give me a line. And the other Gulf countries will look at it. Now, they've wanted it for a while. And so it adds some more protection to the local offshore financial systems, which the FIC are building, which they're relocating to, which they've been putting their offices in. And so this is FIC's mechanism for adjusting to multipolarity. The dollar is no longer imposed upon people like it was under the IMF model. We'll regime change you, we'll destroy your currency, we'll launch a currency war. You have to borrow some dollars. You then have to privatize your companies, and then we'll extract all the resources. We'll put a dictator in so that they will pay them through USAID some corruption. We'll then fund some alternative militia groups via the National Endowment of Democracy for any color revolutions. The old, US hegemonic region model that it copied from the British Empire. So you can't impose the dollars. The dollars are now negotiated. And that's how you manage this transition to multipolarity. And the FIC is effectively taking the assets that it built in America and exporting them globally, while they build these MIC contracts, tick, police, and surveillance states, and FIC alternative payment rails, and use that, the money printing that the American people pay for, and the yield goes to the FIC as well, in order to extract as much as possible. This is the complete asset stripping phase. And that's why they wanted to vassalize Europe into the FIC further as well. So effectively, the petrodollar is fragmenting because there's all these vast US equities and US bonds, and you can't have the yield rate go up. And so when Scott Bessent says, of course we'll do it, it's an ally, it's a good thing. So the old system was effectively, you get US security, like a mafia, we'll destroy your currency, we'll destroy your country. If you need protection, then you get US security, give us our base. And you need to price everything in dollars, and then you need to lend the money back to the US government to push up and roll over. And then we take our money and we invest it in equities. And then we innovate all this technology based upon killing from the military industrial complex. And then eventually we roll it out to retail. Now, the new system under this new model is effectively the Gulf hedging with China, and any country that wants to do this can hedge with China. And you will have the Yuan infrastructure that you integrate into, which is SIPS and Enbridge, the network of central bank digital currencies, and the Chinese payment system in order to settle all of the things you're importing. And then you get swap lines from the Federal Reserve, which becomes your bargaining chips, is to not sell your bonds and to not sell your equity. And how do you get your bonds and equity? Well, you sell energy to China, which has the manufacturing base. And then you either buy gold, you buy some bonds, but you don't buy bonds because you're forced to. You buy bonds now because you want leverage and you want to become a bond vigilante. And you buy equities because you want control over board seats and partnership with the financial industrial complex, where you can negotiate that the MIC doesn't create the forever war in your country. And these are the games that the sovereign wealth funds are able to play as long as they keep their resources, which is why they wanted your resources. This is why they want Venezuela. You can't have your resources. You need to financialize, securitize, and do the neoliberal model. So it's really, really interesting where this is going right now. And that's why more and more central banks are buying gold as well. Now you've got countries that are looking at, within the Iranian and the Russian system, they started becoming the largest sovereign miners of Bitcoin. So did UAE. So you have big mining operations in Russia, Iran, and UAE. I think in Iran, it was nuclear powered as well with the nuclear energy program. And the West is creating the MicroStrategy industrial complex. They're levering up. Wall Street is trying to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible and put it in the custody relationship so that they can issue those paper and get everyone to borrow against their Bitcoin. Whereas the ones that have it in self-custody are the ones that are able to build the immunity against that. But you're getting this new, effectively, bond, equity, gold, Bitcoin system integrated into everyone trying to get the real assets. And that's the game. fiat currencies are a mechanism for extracting the asset that they actually want, which is the real assets. And then they create paper versions in order to extract those assets. And then they over leverage it and they create a central banking system to privatize the gains and socialize the losses. And they dump all the debt on you. And they turn you into collateralized debt obligations. And then they lever the corporate class by loading them up with debt. And then they dump all the debt on the governments. And then they move to the next order. This is exactly what we are seeing right now. You know, and it's really interesting to watch it in real time. Now, they pitch that as UAE is going through distress and needs a bailout. We're basically entering into this dual currency settlement layer. People are focusing on why would people want yuan? What's the dollar? Well, no, you just control the dollar, not with the American system, but through partnerships with FIG. And then they're negotiating their multipolarity. This seems to be what is the managed transition is actually looking like. Now, what do you need in order to make that transition? Well, you need an energy shock. So OPEC comes along and they create an energy shock. That means that again, I want to reiterate, the war is real. Military are more than happy to kill people. They've been doing it all along. They're more than happy to build back better and destroy things. That is the modus operandi. That is the model. But the outcome is controlled. And so I think that's what we're witnessing as this becomes clearer and clearer. So what do? Take 500 million, 50 million barrels off the market, remove it. Take 50 million barrels off the market. That is effectively the largest disruption in modern history. We've never had that. Not in the 1973 oil embargo, not in the demand destruction of the 2000 global financial crisis. And so, of course, oil spikes above 100, but that's just the paper contracts. What's happening with the real oil? If you want real oil, Sri Lanka paid over $200 for oil, real oil, an actual barrel of oil. And the price of actually getting, and Saudi came out and said, good luck trying to get that $100. So the paper market is dislodged from the real market, as it has for silver, as it has for gold, as it has for oil, as it has for all these other commodities, as it has for Bitcoin. And this is just the ultra financialization and securitization. But you can't fix it by printing dollars. This is why the crisis is still to happen. Even if we get out, and open the strait today, it looks like they're trying to engineer the global reset that we talked about. And we know who it benefits. It benefits the countries that have nationalized their energy or commodities. It benefits the countries, the financial industrial complex as a private force. And it benefits the countries that have the largest reserves. That's the game that we're witnessing right now. So we're going to start seeing the diesel and jet fuel shortages. That's the first one that we're going to see right now. So the trucker industry in America is not immune from this. Diesel, anything that relies on diesel and jet fuel, we're already starting to see that. And so flows, continue, but there's structural shortages. And so prices are going up in order to create demand destruction. And we haven't seen any of the full shutdowns yet, but with the countries in Southeast Asia, they're the ones that are going to be first and impacted by this. Then we'll see it in the European Union. That's all to come. It's all to come. That's still there. And yet it's not really priced into any of the stock market because it's got this structural bid through the wealth extraction exercise. This is why the asset holders are benefiting. And the people that are dealing with the inflation that are on the breadline, they're selling their assets to meet their expenses because the price of everything's going up. And this is the game. So we've had no real shutdown yet. No, the disruption has been completely real. But the collapse, I believe, is being managed. So in order to accentuate that, you have seized ships, you have tankers that are, rerouted. We're seeing that frequently. That pushes the prices up as well. You have select enforcement, but not complete enforcement. But the oil still flows at these higher and higher prices. China still imports because they've got leverage through their exports. And routes are still, basically sanctioned or removed. And insurance happens. And so this is FIC operation in partnership as well. And this also applies pressure on the negotiations. So what is really being negotiated here? I think it is the integration of Iran into this complex. And obviously the whole history of Iran was that the British Petroleum wanted to steal the oil. And then they did regime change in order to prevent nationalization. And then that led to a revolution in order to keep the oil. And then that led to the sanctions that led to the alternative structure being built. We had the removal, remember all the operations that happened at the time. You had the removal through the Vietnamese War of the gold standard, the final part of the gold standard replaced with the petrodollar. You had this assassination of King Faisal during the oil embargo. You had the setting up of the covert safari club after the regime change. And then you had the Iranian Revolution, and then you had Iran-Contra affair. And then you had the escalation with Iraq. And then you had all the other disruptions in the gold supplies and the oil supplies in Sudan, Libya, Lebanon. You had the destruction of the banking and financial system in Lebanon, load them all up with IMF debt. You had the dirty war in Syria. Then that's replaced with, taking over of the oil resource. Can you see how this all fits together? It's a mafia. It's a mafia to prop up the currencies. What did, remember with Saddam Hussein, there was one point, some people say this was the cause, some people don't, but I think there's an element of truth in it, that he was going to start pricing in euros. So the real negotiation that's happening with Iran right now, and why I continue to believe that there is a deal, and this is not World War III, and we're not going to anything type of nuclear Samson option, is because it's a big club and you're not invited. So the forward-facing thing that we're seeing right now is that there were negotiations of uranium, and they break down because of ideology. But actually, I believe that this is really about what is the terms of returning the Iranian oil to the market, and what do all the interested parties get? And is somebody on board with that or not? And then do they need to be regime changed? Not structurally, like you saw in Venezuela, but to those that are going to work with transnational capital. And that involves, what is the price of oil? That's OPEC price cartels. Which currency is it going to be? Iran wants some petro-yuan. Saudi kept some petro-yuan, but majority is still petrodollar. Can you price it in dollars, but have it settled in local currencies? What about integration into Enbridge and central bank digital currencies for the Orwellian technocratic state that's being built? That's what's being negotiated, because America, or the FIC, is trying to extract as much as it can, which is why we had seizures of stablecoin, settlements in Bitcoin, pricing in Chinese yuan, and then the requirement to remove the US embassies and the destruction of US infrastructure into new defense contracts. This is not America protecting itself. This is the FIC asset stripping and utilizing the assets and exporting them into multipolarity while it builds a global technical police and surveillance state through these CBDC's mechanisms. And what are the quotas? How much is it going to come on? In OPEC, you have release schedules, and you either default on that agreement or you stick to the agreement. That has an impact on your relationship. What are the settlement rails? Like, this is different when it's done from discounted oil via China through the system versus an unsanctioned Iran. Are you going to be powering Bitcoin mining by a civilian nuclear program? What's going to happen to the uranium? And so uranium is the public-facing weapon, but oil is really the deal. And it always has been, and it always will be. And so remember what I said, I think it was in week 6, that Lebanon is the holdout negotiation because it is the final and most powerful proxy stroke ally model and resistance group. But Lebanon is completely destroyed by the IMF already. So are they trying to turn it into civil war in order to have a shorter term escalate to de-escalate, then a ceasefire and integration of Hezbollah? That's my still base case strategy. And anyone within Hezbollah, because I think Iran will allow it to happen, but anyone within Hezbollah that's not on board with that will have to go through a decapitation campaign, which might explain the build-up that we're seeing right now. Maybe it's not Iran, maybe it's Lebanon, and maybe it's to do with those islands which don't make sense. Remember the UAE islands in the Strait of Hormuz? There's only real 2 targets because it's not a build-up for a ground invasion unless it is agreed and it's Hollywood and it's theatrical and they're going to go grab some uranium like they did during the 12-day war. Or it's settlement of the islands in UAE, which means that that is part of the negotiation. Or it's theatrics on Karg Island, which will just push the price up. And Iran could just drone kill all those people anyway. So it's not real, which implies to me that this is a managed transition of the regional stability, and it's OPEC, it's FIC, and it's the BRICS and the GCC as well. So who actually wins in the end? Well, follow the money. I've covered this throughout this whole thing. In the West is the private corporate interest. They're going to, BlackRock's assets under administration will go up and up and up. Its energy profits will be records. Its defense profits, the military industrial complex. Its financial extraction of assets, cheap assets on the discount, and new payment rails and new multipolar rails. FIC, MIC, TIC. And of course, the police and surveillance state, which there is already an authoritarian model in the East, but we're moving closer and closer. And you started to see in the UK pre-crime arrests from social media, courts approved digital IDs, European CBDCs, Genius Act, stablecoin legislation favoring banks and yield. We started to see that cameras are now going to be integrated with facial recognition. So in the East, the state benefits, which is China, supply chains, extracting gold out of the paper markets, and the alternative rails. And now, rather than dollars being enforced upon you, you use your dollar markets in order to negotiate how much extraction you get and control of the asset stripping operation. Russia and Iran, they get energy control leverage in OPEC, but infrastructure is the mechanism. How much infrastructure is destroyed determines how long you can set back. And that's what I think this is, that's the negotiation that we're witnessing right now. On the Gulf side, they want the pricing. They want the middle of the FX swap lines, the SIPS integration, the Enbridge central bank digital currencies, tax neutrality in the middle, and the petro-yuan and petrodollar. Now, what's the big difference? Saudi still comes out powerful. People are talking about Iran will be a power. They will. This is, at the end of this, but there'll be lots of rebuild contracts to integrate into it, I believe, in the end deal. But Iran has a population of 90 million with a similar number of barrels of oil as Saudi. Saudi has 35 million and America has 320 million. That's why the petrodollar still exists, even when America is an energy exporter, but via bond purchases and equity purchases. And the leverage is whether you sell them. And then on the other side, you have the paper assets that are extracting gold and commodities into Shanghai. And they want some of that oil priced in the petro-yuan. And the Gulf countries want to sit in the middle of it, which is why their ETFs are pushing more and more towards a financial services company because they partnered with the FIC. That's the order. And it requires regional stability, which requires Iran being on board, which requires the proxies and the allies and the resistance coming to settlements. And so I think China put that together. And it requires a frontman like Trump, who works for FIC, that is corrupt enough to just extract us enough money for his personal family to execute it. And they paid him via affinity partners. And then you've got to do the regime changes across radical Zionist Israel, hardliner IRGC, and expose the Epstein class within America, but while still doing the asset stripping and the big print and the wealth extraction and the K-shaped economy, which means the tick needs compensation. If the mix coming out of the Middle East, it needs war in Europe, it needs war in Latin and Central America, and it needs internal civil unrest. And then you get the police and surveillance state. That's the compensation. And Trump is delivering for MICTIC and FIC, but primarily FIC. So the public, what do they get from that? Well, they get the inflation, they get the higher costs, they get their burden of the debt, they get less purchasing power. And if you end up having to sell your assets, then they're trying to turn you in serfs. You will own nothing and be happy. This is World Economic Forum, OPEC, World Economic Forum, CCP, transnational capital. And that's why I continue to believe that this is a degree of coordination while all the atrocities are real. So let's take a little bit of a break, and then we're going to go into some of the stuff that happened on the DeFi collapse, the confiscation, and then we'll go through the Bitcoin side and various other things, and then we'll close this one up into part 2, where I did the interview on Simply Bitcoin as well. So let's have a little bit of break and an AI video.
I will never give you up. The Strait of Hormuz must be shut. Blockade, blockade. In my head, just blockade. Please let the ships go through. Come on, at least a few. If you block me, then I block you. Blockade, blockade. I thought this was easy peasy. Blockade. Now Mecca and Melania leave me. Blockade. Surrender is beneath me. Blockade, blockade. I think soon I get impeached.
Okay, so while those major changes are happening with the FX swap rates, it was interesting, just as I was talking about this, Scott Bessent put out an X post. It looks like they're trying to scale this model. So this is definitely a radical change in the order. And while people were framing it as Dubai needing a bailout, I don't think people got the headlines correct. So you're ahead of that one. Now, at the same time, as I said, we had a real stress in the DeFi market. Now, if you're a long-term listener, you know that I said, don't mess with that stuff. Everything other than Bitcoin has got some centralized money printer, some foundation, some Silicon Valley VCs, and they're just trying to push you into degenerate gambling, and then they allow you to use your assets as collateral, and then you borrow against them and mine some fiat currency, and then there's some freeze function, stable coins, Genius Act compliance. You know, there's a massive difference between Bitcoin and self-custody and the crypto market. And so we started to see real signs of stress. I just want to cover it a little bit. You would have noticed headlines around DeFi massive extractions that were happening on several layers. So we had 577 million that was exploited from a smart contract. I don't care about what it is, called Kelp DAO. A DAO is like a self-enforcing mechanism where you have private keys and then you sign contracts to perform certain functions, and you have this decentralized autonomous organization, i.e. an organization that exists on a smart contract. And they always have more centralized control. They're never quite what they seem. And that led to others that were also rug pulled as well. But it led to about $13 billion of exit from funds locked up in DeFi contracts. And suddenly we had Justin Sun come out and say, hey, Tron is the most decentralized. Because another layer 2 called Arbitrum decided that it wanted to, perform a freeze function and freeze some funds as a result of some of these hacks and some of these compromises. So it shows you. And then Justin Sun came out and said, oh, this is the most decentralized. And then suddenly we had more and more freeze functions from Tether, and the Tether that was built upon Tron, which is the blockchain that Justin Sun created. At the same time, he then released a lawsuit claiming that World Liberty Financial, the company that had significant investment connected to the Trump and Witkoff family. So while Trump is creating war with Iran, or for the MIC, and while the Witkoffs are negotiating with the envoy in the Middle East, the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund was also investing in the World Liberty Financial project. And they were, quote unquote, creating decentralized stuff. Now, their ICO was an epic fail, but they managed to persuade Justin Sun in order to invest in it. And then it raised a lot more at higher prices as a result of Justin Sun subscribing to a chunk of it. And then he got a pardon, or his SEC case kind of went away straight afterwards. And now Justin Sun comes out and launches a lawsuit because allegedly World Liberty Financial froze $1 billion worth of tokens. And so people were using these tokens in order to use them as collateral to end up with stable coins. And $2 billion of those stable coins from investing in Binance through USD1, the stable coin connected to World Liberty Financial, ended up in Binance after the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund invested $2 billion. And Jared Kushner is managing the Trump family wealth while he's negotiating all these different deals. So you can see all of the quid pro quo. And suddenly CZ's got a presidential pardon as well. And this is what's holding up Genius Act right now. Genius Act has passed, which is the stablecoin legislation, but Clarity Act isn't, because they're arguing over the banks wanting yield, and now they want to delay it for 60 to 90 days. So in the end, the banks get the favorable legislation around these stablecoins. At the same time as all these crazy deals being structured, at the same time as hacks happening in the DeFi market that led to all these different freeze functions. All this to say is that Justin Sun, who was saying Tron was decentralized, suddenly had stable coins on Tron. And I've been warning about these things all the way through if you're a long-term listener. And so really the lesson that I want you to take away is that protocols can freeze funds. And Genius Act is requiring stable coins to blacklist and freeze funds. And so this is programmable money, and AI will be doing it into the future as well. And so this is AI programmable freezing of funds based upon eventually your social credit score, which I've been talking about. This is all transitioning to the 1984 Orwellian technocratic state that Trump called crypto capital. We're going to make America great again by making crypto capital. This is a tick operation if ever I saw one. So this is the stable coin system exposing itself. The old rules effectively, and I've always said it, is not your keys, not your coins. But now we need to update it slightly. The new reality, and it's always been the reality as well, is that keys alone does not equal control unless you're using proof of work and Bitcoin in self-custody. And so these freezes are a constant feature in the smart contract stroke alternative stroke decentralized finance. And it's only Bitcoin where there's no one that can freeze it. Proof of work has no freeze function. There is no foundation that has the ability to freeze. And this really highlights it. So we've now got, just in the last week, as all of this is happening, and remember, Iran was charging stablecoins for the Strait of Hormuz on Tron that got seized. So there's something going on here anyway. When you put it all together, just follow the money and it's pretty obvious. And it was also tied to, remember, Cambodian scam that stole some Bitcoin. And because they can't freeze the Bitcoin, they had to do an actual physical raid. And China wanted to pay it out to the victims. And now China's in a court case with the Department of Justice because the Department of Justice took the 127,000 Bitcoin that they seized from scammers in these Cambodian scams and said, we're going to add it as our Bitcoin strategic reserve. So they stole the money from the scammers, and rather than giving it back to victims, they put it on their as their Bitcoin strategic reserve. So the strategic reserve is not about the government buying Bitcoin to pay down its debt. It's about stealing your Bitcoin. And that's where this is all headed. And so in layer one, you're seeing that protocol in these alternative crypto shitcoins actually have the ability to freeze. And in layer two, you've got these stablecoin blacklists that can lead to co-opt of the company in order to freeze, as we always know. Now, what are they doing in layer three and in Bitcoin? Remember, I always talked that we're always under a constant state of hijack. And I was talking about, you can look at my old blogs on Is Bitcoin Hijacked? And I went through all the different operations to try and hijack developers, stable coins, all these different things. It's really worth going through that if you want to see. We're now seeing it in real time. So remember I said, because you've got miners and proof of work and nodes and developers, you can try and infiltrate parts of the ecosystem, but you can't get it all, which is why we're fighting back with nodes, alternative implementations to fight back against developers, more decentralized structures for mining pools, and mining that happens in lots of different countries that hate each other across private, public, different forms of energy, over 25,000 nodes. So all of this is what prevents any of this stuff happening. But we started getting the Google PSYOP saying that you need to protect from quantum computers, which is true. A lot of the banks have been meeting up to think about like how AI hacking, quantum computers, all these big threats that are coming through. But Bitcoin was already on a roadmap, and it only initially affects the quantum addresses from a very old form of wallet address, which was mainly around the Satoshi era in 2009, 2010, that type of era. We've transitioned to other types of wallet addresses, and those quantum resistant wallet addresses, they incur a higher fee. So the next phase is to reduce that fee. And then if we need quantum resistant cryptography, that requires upgrading the ASIC system, which new mining equipment can be done over time. There is a roadmap for achieving that. But a proposal was put forward by Jameson Lopp. And to me, it's the exact opposite direction of what we should be going. But now it does, just because someone proposes it doesn't mean it actually happens. And it won't happen. But it was a potential Bitcoin rule change in order to take those old addresses, weaponize the quantum threat, which suddenly Google said they've got everything they needed, which led to market manipulation to take out these wallet addresses and those old wallet addresses. And now Jameson Lopp comes out and says, well, why don't we just make it where those old wallet addresses have to either upgrade to a new wallet address, which means they'd have to reveal themselves, dox themselves in terms of Satoshi's 1.1 million, which would be incredibly dangerous, or send them to a freeze address, because you can't freeze it at the protocol level. And so obviously this won't happen. But these are the types of PSYOPs we've got to look out for, and the Bitcoin community will never allow these things to happen because the nodes will fight back. The miners will, mine into blocks, but nodes enforce the rules. And you can try and compromise developers. And that's why we've been ensuring that we have completing implementations. And really, I've been highlighting all of the different things like Epstein files attempts. And you can look back through my blog on SimonDixon.com and see all these things. But anyway, the type of old address is called P2PK. Probably none of you will have them, but you can look it up. It's a pay to pub key type of address from the very early days. You can move it to a new wallet type or freeze it was the proposal, but it won't get through. And so you start to notice that these proposals coming as all these freeze functions are happening. And thankfully, Bitcoin is decentralized, but these alternative cryptos are not. So they have to comply because there is always foundations connected to them. So I hope it's a useful lesson to see this in real time, because that's never going to happen in Bitcoin. And so if you look at the capital flows anyway, that's why $13 billion went out of these smart contracts, programmable layers, and about $1 billion went into Bitcoin. Because that is that is exactly where this should all go in the end. If you don't want to take all these freeze function risks and effectively recreate a decentralized version of a centralized system. And even states start to see it. As I said, with the IRGC, they were taking Yuan for their, and that, as I said, leads to the flow of gold into the Shanghai markets, as we covered. They were accepting stable coins. Now those are frozen. And they started accepting Bitcoin. And there's no freeze function. So it's an innocent until proven guilty system. Believe me, I'm not telling anyone. Everyone needs to comply with the law. Like sanctions laws are very, very serious. You need to comply with them. There are serious consequences to not do that. But I'm just giving commentary on what's actually happening. So only one layer sits below all the different freeze controls and freeze functions. And we know we're lining up for the big print. And the big print, part of that will be likely stable coins or a transition to CBDCs or any of the things. And all the signals are coming through. We started to see this week that Treasury did a $40 billion buyback of long-dated treasuries so that they could refinance them with short-dated treasuries. The Fed started buying some of these long-dated bonds because other people weren't buying them. Japan's still the largest holder because of the Japan carry trade, and we started to see extension of more FX swap lines. We're starting to see that Japan in this crisis is going to need to purchase oil. You either give it extended FX swap lines, but maybe they're already out. Their yields are starting to play the arbitrage trade and the currency trade. So that trade is deviating at the same time as the stress in Europe and the euro dollar, at the same time as the stress in the GCC and the petrodollar. That's why we're having these radical changes and the model's changing in line with what I said. But the Treasury is starting to issue more and more short-dated treasuries, which means rollover at lower, trying to get interest rates down, but it's still higher than the 3.3% average that's being paid, which is why we had the regime change at the Federal Reserve. So Kevin Walsh he had his Senate hearing and had to take all the questions. And what's his strategy? Well, one of his strategies is to say, we're not going to use PPI, the producer price index, as our model for inflation. We're going to be using a new model. And that new model always prints inflation at below the PPI rate. So effectively, rather than saying, we're structurally going to have 3 to 4% inflation instead of 2%, we're just going to change the metric by which we use our model. And so basically, he admitted that he's focused on decreasing interest rates. Now he's saying, or has historically said, that they're going to get the lower balance sheet too. Of course, you can't have decreased interest rate and a lower balance sheet at the Fed because the Fed's got to buy all these bonds. And so they're changing the definition of inflation in order, and the matrix that they're going to be using in order to push towards this inevitable big print that we're seeing right now. If any foreign holder sells their bonds, then you have rising yields and the Fed has to combat it. And we're starting to see more and more of that. Globally, we're seeing rising yields. The amount in more distressed countries like UK and Japan, those are going up further and further. And so the bond market is under its real structural stress, which is why a deal has to be done. You can't have the straight close for the rest of the year because it breaks these things. And it also increased the debt costs, which the FIC like, but that's part of the asset stripping operation. But you can't have it as too high where it's demand destruction. So we also had, what is the other way of dealing with this inflation? Well, when you're dealing with inflation from a big print, you either print less, which you can't do, or you have massive productivity increases, which is AI, which is why we're seeing massive layoffs. So the productivity increase is coming at the extent of the job market. The bond market and inflation is the issue with the structural inflation. Now you've got structural unemployment through artificial intelligence. The other way is to tax more. And so Trump tried that, tariffs. Tariffs was a tax on US small business. It led to about 350 billion. And now we're seeing US small business, they can apply for $166 billion of tariff rebates because the court said it was unlawful. Now, whether there's another plan or not, the point is that the tariff policy is gone. So what did the tariff policy do in the end? It was driving the world to multipolarity, and it was mergers and acquisitions and sending small businesses bankrupt for FIC. And now it's not got the offsetting inflationary effect because there's tax rebates. So the businesses went bust. Everyone reset their relationships. China benefited. And that's exactly what I said on Dollar Liberation Day will effectively happen. I didn't know we were going to get a tariff rebate. That was another one. So now you paid twice and you paid inflation. And so that's why there's a massive sprint to increase these swap lines right now. What else is the government doing? Bailing out airlines. We saw Spirit Airlines, which was already in bankruptcy, already distressed. And apparently there's a credit line for $500,000 or so, or $500 million to bail out the airlines as a result of these energy crises. Because of the diesel shortages are going to impact the trucking industry, and fuel shortages. How are you going to solve that? Self-driving cars, robotics, artificial intelligence. There's only one outcome, and it is massive, ginormous money printing. And so you need narratives in order to do that. An energy crisis is one. What is impacted by energy? AI. AI is the backbone of all this LNG consumption right now. It's about 10% of all the LNG. So you manufacture an AI national security risk. China's going to win. It can be real as well. And you create an energy crisis so that China's guaranteed to win because they're doing it with all these cheaper models and they are pushing out renewable energy on a scale you've never seen before. And they had the oil that they purchased at the $45 and then all the LNG reserves that they built. Close the Strait of Hormuz, you break the AI trade. Now, you can't have the stock market crashing. The Gulf countries are no longer investing. They get their FX swap lines. You can't have them selling their bonds. And so, you know, because that will cause yields to go out of control. But if they do, you end up with a big print. The banks have covered this checkmate every way it goes. And so now you need to bail out all the AI companies to build the large one world government, police and surveillance state, social credit score, Orwellian nightmare that comes from this. And so all in all, if that breaks, where else is the money? Private credit. You know, so if the Gulf countries money foreign direct investment, then you've got the private credit market. Then the Fed's going to buy it and there's going to be money printing. And so this is why last week I did that interview on BTC Sessions with Larry Labard, the author of The Big Print. And he was estimating a mechanism for $7 to $10 trillion of liquidity. We're starting to just see bit by bit whether we have one big event in order to do that. One estimate is you push the stocks to all new all-time highs. The supply chain issues really kick in. You have a big correction and a big print that pushes it up to new all-time highs again. That's kind of my baseline theory of what's happening with the stock market. But the bond market's getting more distressed, rolled over, rolled over, rolled over. And what do you sacrifice? You sacrifice the dollar as world reserve currency. That's the casualty that has to go. And that's why I think still we're leading to this May the 14th, and why the yuan is strengthening relative to the dollar in order to rebalance that import and export relationship, which means more debt for the West, more gold for the East, with FX swaps and Middle Eastern countries using the petrodollar and the petro yuan in order to manage this world of multipolarity. And then both countries need to go chip independent and the manufacturing base, which means structurally more expensive goods in America and structurally cheaper goods, and the Belt and Road Initiative then invest in the rebuild. That's what I think we're going to get out of this and where this is all going. So let's do one more little break, and then I'm going to come back with all the final parts together of what this looks like. And then we'll move over to part 2 with my interview on Simply Bitcoin.
United States of Israel, that's your resume. Killing children every day while you look away. United States of Israel, Netanyahu's pet, Trump is a pedophile. Don't you forget. 4 years of tweets at 3 a.m. unhinged and unwell. Bro, go to sleep. The Oval Office turned into a circus tent from hell. Your reliability wrapped in the spray tan and the tie. The tie though, taped in the back. Even your suit is a lie. You said I alone can fix it. Fixed what? The grift. Sir, this is a Wendy's. Gave your whole family government jobs as a gift. Mar-a-Lago mansion, classified docs on the floor. What was that? Box of secrets by the bathroom door. I'm really rich, said the man who begs for donations. LMAO, selling Bibles and sneakers to a broke nation. Gold-plated toilet can't flush the truth. It's giving con man, every indictment just more proof. You don't run a country, you run a brand. A broke one. 6 bankruptcy built on stolen land. The people who voted for you still can't afford their rent. Mega magic, baby, that's where all your promises went. United States of Israel, that's your resume. Killing children every day while you look away. United States of Israel, Netanyahu's pet, Trump is a pedophile. Don't you forget. You marketed fear and sold it to the working class. Facts. Promised them the world, gave them nothing but gas. Your voters lost their jobs, their health, their home. It's the stock market though. Yeah, for people with portfolios and second homes and loans. BB pulls the strings and you perform the dance. Good boy. Guys are burning while you clap and chant. You call it peace deals, we call it what it is. Genocide shit. Blood on the hands of your whole administration's beards. From Iran, we're watching every move you make. See you. Every child killed is a lie. You'll never shake. You threaten us on Twitter like we tremble and fold. Nah, son, Iran don't get threatened. Iran just gets cold. United States of Israel, Netanyahu's dead. Trump is a pedophile. Don't you forget.
Okay, let's summarize this all together, because we really dug deep into the currency war element of what I think is coming next, so that you can prepare yourself and think about it. So let's summarize all the different roles and what we're seeing. So the US role in this new world order is to protect the equity and debt markets. So bonds need to roll over, the debt needs to increase, equity can't be sold, and the currency needs to be strategically weakened and managed in order to get capital outflows everywhere. And then you utilize, Mick, Fick, and Tick in order to build that into a multipolar world, so that the private interest can benefit from this multipolar world. Once this war is over, we will return to, and we've already started to return to, the trend of the dollar weakening relative to Chinese currencies, China's currency, and then the commodity-backed currencies, gold, and various other things that we've covered as well. China's role is basically to build the alternative systems, but not to have world reserve currency because it has its capital controls. So it doesn't want to be controlled by FIC. So it will continue those capital controls, which means that you'll get this accumulation and extraction of gold into the Chinese system as a result of the new structural setup. The FX swap lines will guarantee that just structurally in terms of these stress of the paper markets relative to the Shanghai gold exchange. The Gulf countries will effectively extract as much as it can from both with a tax neutral bridge in the middle and manage via OPEC with Saudi as the head of it, the petro Yuan and the petrodollar. That will eventually be disrupted by China through renewable energies, alternative energies, nuclear energies, and Agenda 2030 and all these different things of diversifying away from fossil fuels. China will continue to use coal and all these different things. There is going to be major, major volatility around energy, and we are moving to LNG growing significantly and being the backbone of the police and surveillance state. EVs, batteries, stable coins, central bank digital currencies, social credit scores, social media, artificial intelligence. Nothing stops that train. The only thing you can do is have sovereign power to protect yourself, which is why I always focus on your sovereign wealth building. But the Gulf will extract from that and manage effectively with FIC the multipolarity flows while the police and surveillance state one world system is being built. Bitcoin is your exit. And there is no freeze function. Everything else has a freeze function built into it by design. They want to control your purchasing behaviors. They want to control your speech through rewarding and these social credit systems and probably carbon credits and everything else that they're going to do as BlackRock tokenizes everything with these freeze function crypto projects and tokenization, securitization, and financialization. But Bitcoin will give you that non-freeze function settlement layer that you need in building your sovereign and community-based systems. And so my final message to you is that this is not just war. I've tried to help you understand the factions of power as I see it. I've given my opinion on where I think this goes next. I've said pretty much what I need to say, and we'll continue to analyze this each week because I really think that this is one of the biggest, most significant shifts we'll ever see. There's the war, and there's the structural changes with artificial intelligence. This is the system base. This is a new system that is being transmitted via this war. And it is a complete monetary reset. And everyone needs to get themselves ahead of it. It only rewards you if you hold the assets that are able to outperform the big prince. And what results come from this? Structural unemployment is being built into the system. And they're dealing with the inflation that results through AI, robotics. Some will be higher levels of tax. And the shakeout is they are manufacturing civil unrest in order to make the extremist version of you to play you off against each other so that they can usher in this police and surveillance state. And what stock is Trump promoting? Palantir. Palantir is the new privatized police and surveillance state government, integrated with the technical industrial complex, managed by the financial industrial complex, and reset using the military industrial complex. And any world leader that's not on board, that is not sovereign, will be regime changed. And that's the model. It's not for the American empire anymore. It's for transnational capital in a multipolar world with a one world government being built through technology. When I say the human cost is real, they don't care. But the outcome is negotiated. And that's what I mean when I say theatrics, when people get offended by it. So I always said throughout this whole thing, what they build in Gaza and what you tolerate in Gaza is what will be coming back home. And I think that's really playing out that way. And we're seeing that. And we need to protect ourselves. And the way we do that is focusing on our sovereign strategy, making our company more sovereign, more community driven, and maybe building out sovereign systems through your wealth by controlling lobbies, and changing from within. What I have noticed is there are two types of people right now. One type of person is somebody that is benefiting from the system and they're very quiet right now because they just want the train to continue so that they can get their wealth at the right side of this change. The others are completely defeated, outside of the system, and they're angry. They're getting angrier and angrier and angrier. You're seeing them blowing up and burning down warehouses at the moment. That's going to continue. That's how this system is designed. And they're talking out, but they don't have any wealth to make a difference. What I want is a group of people that have built their sovereign wealth strategy, have the wealth and influence to make a difference, have companies that are sovereign and able to make a difference, and then speak out, even though so that that's the only way you change the system. That's why when Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund boycotted Israel, and now European Union may be able to have these settlement sanction processes, that's when real change happens, because it is when you can real change the real capital. If you look at all the resistance, is when resistance is combined by state sponsorship. And that's what changes the mission, because the state sponsor has their own goals. He who puts in the capital and those that partner with the capital are the ones that get to make the difference. And you can make a difference if you don't have capital by either becoming a sovereign wealth builder or partnering with capital. And being one of those people that actually speaks out, even if it's against the preservation of the status quo. And that's the only way I think we'll make a difference. And even if we can't, at least you'll be the next elites if you protect yourself in the right way, which is why I think you don't vote by wasting time in politics, because they'll buy you and they're captured. You maybe can support the local politicians, support the local farmers, the local community, invest local. That's how we win. The thick have captured the big federal games, the big, and we change the system from within. So in part 2, I did an interview on Simply Bitcoin, which we're going to play right now. And if you want to understand why this keeps happening, and why the debt keeps rolling over, I answered all those questions in the interview. And why it's always the same players that are always winning, because sadly people are playing the game wrong. Once you understand the rules, then you know how to win. So you have to understand the system, and it's only through understanding the system that you'll do that. So in part 2, I answered that question on the Simply Bitcoin. I go through the financial industrial complex structurally. If you haven't watched some of my previous videos, the debt-based system, how it works, why it's a Ponzi scheme, the governance, as the different tools of governance, and of course, Bitcoin as the exit. So enjoy part 2, how the banking system has turned you into a debt slave. My interview on Simply Bitcoin, and this was aired on the 19th of April, 2026. Always remember, you're alive at one of the craziest and most interesting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. I want you to be on the right side of that change. Peace. I'll see you next week.
I have to take people to a dark place because
No, let's do it.
once you know how the system works, you know how to win. And so here's how we win. We're not going to fix the system, but what we can do is
Absolutely.
commercial banks, they create, dollars, pounds, euros every time they issue a loan. And in order to issue more loans, their first goal is to turn every single individual into a collateralized debt obligation by getting them addicted to debt, either via mortgages, via credit cards, via student loans, via inflation that doesn't increase at the same rate of their wages. You effectively turn every individual into a debt slave. They socialize the losses across all the individuals of a nation and they privatize the gains. Your vote doesn't matter because they have access to the deep state. And so once you understand this, you realize it's a big club and you're not invited.
And we're not in it. Yo, welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. I haven't done one in a while, but I have the one and only legendary Simon Dixon. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me again. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, I mean, Simon, this is the first episode I've ever had with you personally, and I've just been a huge fan of all the content that you've done for, not only your channel, but a lot of the other content creators in the space. And I think your view on things, especially because of how much time you've been in the industry, Simon, are very unique. And I think it's people that I think it's important that people pay attention to that specifically. So you've coined the term, financial industrial complex, which kind of reminds me of the military industrial complex. And you're making the case that basically that is what we are up against. So, for our viewers, what are you talking about when you say that?
Yeah. So many people, I've spent probably the last 25 years of my life directly working in the financial industrial complex, fighting the financial industrial complex from both a political, business and investing level as an activist investor. And that kind of drove me to Bitcoin. And also academically, teaching and learning what this concept of a financial industrial complex is. And really, it has captured all Western governments. It has co-opted governments that effectively manage to keep their resources and build sovereign wealth funds. And it cooperates with sovereign governments like the Chinese Communist Party, which effectively is a government where no one is above it within their, within their ecosystem. And then you've got the other extreme, which is somewhere like America or UK, where the government are fully subordinate to this financial industrial complex. So what does it consist of? Well, at the base layer, it is the creators of fiat currency, which is the commercial banks. And those commercial banks, they create, dollars, pounds, euros every time they issue a loan. And in order to issue more loans, their first goal is to turn every single individual into a collateralized debt obligation. And that means that by getting them addicted to debt, either via mortgages, via credit cards, via student loans, via inflation that doesn't increase at the same rate of their wages, you effectively turn every individual into a debt slave. Now, some people take that debt and they purchase assets and they're able to beat the inflation. Most people take that debt and they consume and they end up in an ever increasing cycle of debt. And even as they succeed, as they become higher and higher up in a corporate ladder, then they end up with a better house on debt or a better car on debt, or rolling over debt to purchase assets. And it's just effectively a never-ending cycle of debt. Now, some people take that debt and they build a company, and that company basically then gets co-opted by a cycle of the financial industrial complex. Initially, it may be venture capital, where you give away some of the ownership of your company to investors. Then maybe your company succeeds a little bit further and you get access to the private equity or the private credit markets. But the ultimate goal is to turn you into a Wall Street vehicle and Wall Street wrapper by taking you public. And then once you're public, as you go further and further up the ladder, they try and load you up with bonds and corporate debt and junk bonds and various other things. All of them make you subordinate to a governance structure where you need more and more capital to grow. As you grow further and further, you then need to be included in the index funds. And as you go further and further up this cycle, you realize that it's the index funds and the investment banks and the bond market that controls you, your board, your governance structure, and your mission. And so this is through the investment banking sector, the private equity sector, and the venture capital sector. Then what happens is effectively they need a mechanism for investing, but they don't want to use their own money. They can create money through their private, through the retail banks. But then they also want to manage people's money. And so they create insurance products, they create pension products, they create endowment funds where they can influence the university education system, they can influence the state governments, but effectively they manage these large pools of capital that gives them trillions of dollars that they can then allocate and dictate the flow of capital via the asset management industry. Finally, when they take bets with your money and when they create money, they need the whole system to be guaranteed because the entire economy is subordinate to this structure. And so they have a central banking system. And within the central banking system, they effectively, every time things go wrong, they socialize the losses across all the individuals of a nation and they privatize the gains. Then they need to control the government. And so when the government effectively borrows money, they want to be the lender of the money and they also want to be the recipient of the money within their portfolio. And so we have these lobbies which effectively rent the Senate, the Congress, in order to control the politicians and direct the flow of money printing into their corporate entities that they own shares of. And then finally, they need wars because what happens is once the individuals are all in debt and the companies are all subordinate to your debt and your debt capital markets and equity capital markets, and the government is subordinate to your debt, you need mechanisms for making sure that that debt continually rolls over forever in a Ponzi scheme, because there's never enough debt to pay off all the money, and the currency actually is debt. And so you need that to continue. And so the mechanism for doing that is effectively the military industrial complex, a group of military companies that create war. What they do is they have underneath them access to intelligence agencies in the deep state. And those deep state intelligence agencies are able to bribe judicial branch. So they can manipulate the law in their favor even when they get it wrong. And effectively, at the very top of this, they install board seats into all public companies. They have shares in virtually everything. They become the number one shareholders via ETFs and managing the pension money. And effectively, they control every aspect of government, every aspect of corporate, every individual that's in debt. And whenever it goes wrong, they socialize the losses and privatize the gains until eventually they dump all the debt on the government and the people. And then they need to create an inflationary cycle, reset the empire, and go find a new world order in order to do the cycle again. You know, they did this with the Dutch. They did this with the British. They've now done it with the Americans. And now we're looking at a transition into the next structure of the financial industrial complex. So what do they have to do? They then have to co-opt every country. So they partner with any country that keeps their resources and they get sovereign wealth funds. And the ones where they can destroy all their resources, privatize it, securitize it, tokenize it, burden them with debt, destroy their currencies through currency wars, they effectively make their central banks a member of the central banks of central banks, which is the Bank for International Settlements. They burden them with debt through the International Monetary Fund, and then they bail them out through the World Bank. And this is the financial industrial complex.
Absolutely fascinating. And so many things that I would think are not interconnected are all interconnected. And I was just connecting the dots while you were talking about that. And it's true. BlackRock and Vanguard do own a big portion of every Fortune 500 company. It's true that essentially, the Federal Reserve essentially bails out the United States government every so often. It's true that we see this trend of continuous wars, and there's really no good explanation for it until, you laid out what you laid out. We had what really opened my eyes, Simon, was we had this so-called outsider that ran on the platform of ending the wars in the Middle East. He really moved the Overton window in his famous debate back in 2016, where he said he called out the Iraq War, which is something that you're not supposed to do. Survived an assassination attempt, came up with this cabinet that was bipartisan. He had RFK Jr., he had Tulsi Gabbard. And then within 1 year, he essentially transformed into George W. Bush 2.0. And then once again, the United States finds itself in another war in the Middle East. So, and Simon, please, correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but it almost feels as if elections really don't have consequence. And it almost feels like it is not a country, by the people, for the people. I think as long as there's a central bank in place, it's going to be a country by the government for the benefit of the government. What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's one step further. And this is where people really get confused, because I'll call it the FIC now rather than the financial industrial complex. So the FIC also fund all the universities and the education. So they turn doctors into drug dealers. They turn economists into debt dealers. And they basically co-opted all of the economic models that came from previous literatures. And they kind of said, the world is either socialist, communist, capitalist, or fascist. And the Wall Street controls them all. Also, all of them, they engineered and created them through wars. But it's a false illusion. And so people look at these different models and they think it's the government. The government has two functions in a system that's fully captured by FIC. The first function is they are a piggy bank. Their job is to create a new narrative of how the money gets from the money printer or any budget that they benefit through the bond market, through the government debt, over to the corporate sector. And they just need to say whatever. If you're on the left, you say social programs. Who manages those social programs? The big insurance companies and the FIC. And then if you're on the right, you say, oh, let's create a deregulated environment. And then in that deregulated environment, you reallocate all the money over to favorable terms for the FIC. And so the FIC goes on an M&A spree. They're able to monopolize further. Miraculously, they pretend they're trying to be conservative and pay down the debt. But because the dollar is debt, because money is debt, you can't pay it down. And so you have these little gains like the Department of Government Efficiency, where they pretend they're going to pay down the debt. And what do they end up doing? They actually end up just giving all the data to their portfolio companies like Palantir, because they control the surveillance state and the technical industrial complex, the TIC. And they put budgets from the Pentagon over to the military industrial complex, the MIC, and they own shares in all those companies. And so the government is a piggy bank for the financial industrial complex. They receive all the yield on the bonds, they manage all of your money, and they control the governments. The government also performs a second function, which is a couple of functions. One is that they create an illusion that the budget that they need is from your tax. Tax is actually just a way of taking money out of the system and dampening inflation. And so if you want to control the inflation to a certain degree, you need to find new ways of taxing people. And that takes money out of the system to dampen some of the inflation. But they never use it to balance their budget, because it's particularly in America, the dollar is the debt, the currency is the debt. and the largest export of the FIC is debt. And that's why, you got up to almost 40 trillion in the case of America. The third thing they do is they create a narrative where people think they have a democracy and they get a say and that their vote matters. Your vote doesn't matter because they have access to the deep state, and the deep state engineers and controls the media. And the media creates a strategic tension of left and right. And so they just go ping pong left to right throughout that. And they're a battering ram. Their job is just to create a narrative. And each time they create a narrative in a new election, you get pissed off and think you need to regime change. And so you regime change and you either go further to the left, further to the right, and you keep going and you look and you blame the politician. They're so stupid. They're incompetent. Most of them are highly competent. You just don't know who they work for. They work for their lobbies. And so whenever I look at a politician, I just go down the list of who their largest funders are, and I predict what I think the agenda is going to be. So the government are a battering ram, a mechanism for dampening inflation through tax, and a piggy bank. Their job for the FIC is to dump all the debt on the people and make sure that that money goes into propping up their share prices until they control most of the assets. And so governments are irrelevant other than performing that function for the FIC. And people get very confused by that.
Yeah, no, and it's extremely confusing, Simon, to say the least. And I really, for me, I even, and I've been in Bitcoin for a decade, but I even fell for the, because I saw it, the questionable 2020 election, and then, Trump, the assassination attempt, the epic picture of saying him fight, 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 fight. So I even fell into the whole, left and right kind of debate. But what I've come to realize this year, and I think you've really had your finger on the pulse on this for a very, very long time now, is the elections are inconsequential. There is no left and right. I completely agree with you in terms of the legacy media being used as a tool to divide and conquer, right? When the left is in power, the right-wing media is like, it's the left fault. When the right is in power, the left-wing media goes and it's the right's fault. The pendulum swings, so to speak, but that that mechanism that you just described continues doing what it's doing. Why do you think not enough people have woken up to this reality? Because for me, it was really this year that I really woke up to it. Like I didn't have a lot of faith in elections before. I think as a Bitcoiner, you inherently, believe that, the solution to this is to opt out, putting your Bitcoin into self-custody. That's really the most powerful vote you can make. But do you think that the Overton window is shifting enough? Do you think that people are finally coming to that realization? Because from what I'm seeing is Trump's base is completely divided at this point. You have, independent media like Tucker, like Candace, like the big ones, right? They're basically saying like, Trump, what are you doing? You betrayed your base. And then you turn on Fox News, you live in a different reality. They're like cheerleading him along. It's Looney Tunes. It's crazy. So is the Overton window shifting? Do you see people waking up to this reality, or are they still kind of stuck in this matrix?
I think people have been more awake than they ever have in their lifetime, but it's generational. So a change in an empire is not really something we all live through. Most people die before an empire changes. So everybody that's awake today is finding out what a regime change looks like. And the FIC is executing a regime change right now. And so what that looks like is things like we are experiencing. The British people, up until World War I and through World War I and World War II, they thought that the Brits were civilizing people, exporting democracy, and they were beacons of freedom and goodness and civilization. And then when we had World War I and World War II, and there was a regime change from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve, from the Dutch East India Company to the British East India Company, to the military industrial complex in America, and then later BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. People, it's not until the end that you realize, oh, the British Empire was evil. And then the history books are rewritten. And then you have to go through undo all of the media manipulation and education manipulation that you did to make people think that they were doing good through this whole time. And so we're going through a re-education camp within America. Now, that's not because they're like, okay, we need to change America. It's because they're systematically doing a managed transition away from dollar as world reserve currency to a world of multipolarity. And so within that, you need to deconstruct everything that propped up the dollar. There are several mechanisms that propped up the dollar. One of them is the Japan carry trade, which was leftover mechanism from World War II when you installed the Bank of Japan. There was also the installation and regime change around the German central bank after the Hitler regime was taken out. The governor of the Federal Reserve was also his brother. The Warburg family was also the leader of the Reichsbank, the German bank. So Wall Street was effectively funding fascism. It also executed a regime change within Russia where it replaced the Tsar with the Soviet Union and created the Communist Manifesto. That was funded by Wall Street. They also switched over to the Federal Reserve System. So you had fake capitalism, communism, and fascism, and that made the strategic tension and the justification for all the war. Then you need a narrative. You need the Soviets to believe that they're fighting. You need the fascists to believe that they're fighting. You need the capitalists to believe that they're fighting. And you need them all to believe that they are effectively in a holy battle for good and they're on the right side of history. So you write history to that effect. And so the American empire was built upon that. But now they're deconstructing it. So you break the Japan carry trade, you break the euro dollar, which was based upon Germany being a manufacturing base, and that required cheap energy. And you break the petrodollar, which is what we're witnessing right now. You also have to regime change some of the powers that propped up the dollar. The quote unquote deep state, which was covert wars all around the world via funding mechanisms like USAID and the National Endowment of Democracy. You say you install someone as president that's taken down the deep state. And when you take down the deep state, you take down the constructs that propped up the dollar. So it looks like you're doing good. That was the Doge operation. Then you also need to have a mechanism for ruining every relationship that propped up American hegemon power. That was tariffs. And so tariffs renegotiated every relationship, made all the many small businesses in America go bankrupt because it was a tax on American small business, allowed foreign organizations to put transnational capital to purchase infrastructure that was going bankrupt as a result of the exports and tariffs, and also drove everyone towards China's manufacturing base. And so you need to frame America as a destabilizing force and China as a beacon of stability. And so there's been lots of operations. Tariffs was the perfect one to do it. Then you need to systemically wipe out the morality of what people believe. That was the Epstein files. And so by releasing the Epstein files, you make everybody understand that much of this blackmail network that propped up corporate America was actually an evil blackmail and pedophilia ring. And actually it was weapons trafficking, humans trafficking, sex trafficking, and everything that normal people think are disgusting. And you effectively destabilize the empire. Then you need a global reset event. That's what we're experiencing right now, which is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which leads to the changing and repricing of 50 different commodities, energy, and that sets the new world order. So in the 15th of May, this year, Trump will be meeting with Xi Jinping. And the outcome of that was effectively will be the next world order. That will mark the change. And Trump delivered that because then you look at, well, who benefited from this? You have a look. Well, it was the countries that actually had nationalized oil. That's Iran and Russia. It was the country that had the manufacturing base and everyone's exports were dependent upon. That's China. And then it was the private corporate interest that managed to get new LNG contracts and new oil contracts. That was Chevron, Exxon, Cheniere Energy, which is 70% owned by Qatar, 30% owned by Exxon, and Golden Pass is 70% owned by Qatar, and then Cheniere Energy as well. And so when Trump says, we're kicking ass, we're taking on China, we're closing the strait, and we're getting all the energy, America has all the solution. America doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund. America doesn't benefit from it. American private corporate interest of big oil, which represents 1% of GDP, benefits, but 60% of GDP, which is the American people, suffer because they pay the inflation, which just came in at 4%. And then they also pay the increase in the debt, which is about to come in at 40%. And where did that money come from? The military industrial complex, they got 1.5 trillion stimulus check. The financial industrial complex, they own all of the different companies and they get a concentration of power because this will lead to a big print, just like after the global financial crisis. And what else will happen? Well, the civil unrest that results from this, food insecurity, supply chains that break down, lockdowns, is Operation Warp Speed 2.0, just like Trump did in term one. Who benefits from that? The technical industrial complex with their police and surveillance state. So what did Trump do? He put the PayPal mafia in. Through the Department of Government Efficiency, he created effectively what is now our social credit score through X. And now today they announced that everyone's going to be trading and doing financial services and stable coins through X. That's your social credit score. They said freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach because they weren't censoring anymore. They wanted us to talk so we could build our score. They then did Genius Act and Clarity Act. They did stable coins, and then they handed over the yield to the banks and the financial industrial complex. The tech companies needed to apply for banking licenses in order to pay yield on their stable coins. So they had to join the Federal Reserve System, which is the number one shareholder of the Bank for International Settlements, effectively. And also you get the stimulus check for the military, the massive money printing for the FIC, and then the police and surveillance state for the TIC. Who is Trump funded by? Now let's look at the lobby that installed him. The number one funder was Elon Musk. So Elon Musk he's a node in the TIC. The second biggest funder was the banking dynasty of the Mellon banking family, FIC. And who was the third largest funder? Mariam Edelstein. Mariam Edelstein is connected with Israel. Israel is a node for the MIC to create war in the Middle East. And so you get a MIC stimulus, a FIC stimulus, and a TIC stimulus. So Trump's job is just to take all of this and make it look like it's for the American people, MAGA. And then you get psyops by the CIA like Q, where people think he's playing 5D chess. So they start publishing every move, and his MAGA base just becomes the lowest denominated idiot in the end, because things just get worse and worse and worse. And then suddenly you say, well, he's working with China, he's working with Russia, and lo and behold, we get a multipolar world, and he has delivered. Now, he will be known as like a traitor, he created a war, everyone will be confused. But that's because he thought he worked for the American people. He worked for the FIC, and he did a great job for the FIC, and everything he's doing is rational because they're cashing in, and they're doing incredibly well. And the people are paying the debt, and they get the inflation. And so once you understand this, you realize it's a big club and you're not invited.
And we're not in it. Simon, so you're blowing my mind right now. And a lot of these things, again, I'm connecting the dots while you're talking. And again, it explains a lot of the actions, right, that he's making that, again, as you said, are confusing, right? They don't kind of make sense. But you did describe earlier on in the conversation how this has been happening since, like, basically it was World War I, then World War II, and it's kind of like this kind of regime change that happens every cycle. Who are the puppet masters here? Like, who are the main beneficiaries? Are these, like, rich families? Where are they based out of? Like, who's really pulling the strings?
Yeah. People want to think that this is some organized cabal that never changes. It actually is a ruthless game of backstabbing. And it is a governance structure more like a mafia. If you continue to add value to the mafia, then you continue to rise in the mafia. If you don't continue to provide value to the mafia, then you get knocked down the mafia. And what does that look like? Well, everybody as they climb the ladder needs to be integrated into a compromised network. And so that's why you saw so many names in the Epstein files. There are blackmail networks, there are compromised networks, but mainly it's done through capital. So then you look at who's on top of capital. Well, originally, it was the Dutch, it was the Dutch that created this construct with the Dutch East India Company, the limited liability company, the stock market and the bond market that came from the Dutch Empire. Then when the Brits created a superior military fleet, they took over the constructs. We had the British East India Company, we had the Bank of England, and we bankrupted the British government. And then once we got to the bankruptcy phase, you need a change of empire. So World War I was that. And so during World War I, effectively, you created what later became Israel by the Rothschild family. That was to destabilize the Middle East and get access to oil. You then did the Bolshevik Revolution, which was to get access to Russia's oil. And then you created the Bank for International Settlements to manage Germany reparations into the British Empire and the American Empire. And then the Federal Reserve System was the precursor to making all of that happen. Then you needed a pump cycle, which was a debt leveraging event, the 29 cycle. Then you needed a Great Depression where the Fed rug pulled everybody and ended up concentrating all banks into a smaller and smaller number of banks, rug pulling everybody's wealth. You go into a Great Depression, which is effectively a wealth confiscation exercise. You steal everybody's gold. You take Germany's gold, you take the British colonial gold, you take Russia's gold. You put it in Fort Knox and the Fed, and then you steal the American people's gold by making it where they have to hand it in, and gold ownership illegal. And then you effectively need a World War II. The winner of the war gets to rewrite history, so everything we were told about World War I and World War II was completely false. But then you have an event, a new world order, as it were, which was Bretton Woods. And so Bretton Woods effectively was where you had this military industrial complex. Now, what happened at that time, you had the wealthy European families, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, all the legacy, the Medici families and all these various wealthy families. They became the shareholder class in the managed transition. And so they ended up with shares in many of the banks, many of these different things. But then a manufacturing base and the military companies, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon, Boeing, they all became really important. And so you manufacture strategic tension, communism versus capitalism, the Cold War. This is to make sure that you can continually fund wars. And then we entered into that power change. Now, what happened is when they entered into the Korean War and then the Vietnamese War, based upon the communism versus capitalism argument, they funded Europe, they split it up, they funded the rebuild on both sides. They effectively entered into a phase of bankruptcy, which was 1971. They regime changed JFK into Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson started continuing the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War bankrupted the US government. And then what they said is, now, that promise that we made where everyone can convert their dollars into gold at the IMF? We kind of can't do that anymore. So everybody changed it where your currency is not backed by gold. Your currency is backed by dollars. Our dollars are backed by gold, but now you can't exchange them for gold. And so we entered into the next cycle, which was the petrodollar. So now you had military being important, legacy finance being important, and the shareholder class. But when they managed to actually default and remove the gold standard, we entered into the rise of FIC as a primary power. Now, what they needed is a mechanism for propping up the debt. And so they created the petrodollar. This is when the CIA assassinated King Faisal. Israel pushed and created a destabilization force in the Middle East. You had the Yom Kippur War. King Faisal then did an oil embargo. That led to in 1973, the stagflation. That also led to an intelligence network called Safari Club that laid the construct for what later became 9/11 via Saudi intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and the CIA. And then they created the fake war on terror as the next mechanism so that you could always have strategic tension in the Middle East and push the narrative away from communism versus capitalism to the war on terror. But it was propped up by the petrodollar. You had to ensure that none of the countries in the Middle East could unify around their oil resources. And King Faisal was the last one that did that. So they assassinated, regime changed, and created the petrodollar. The petrodollar said, every time you purchase oil in dollars, you must purchase US treasuries, lend it back to the US government so that we can roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. And effectively, that went right through to Trump administration 1. The debt went spiraled. We had the fake war on terror. We had 9/11 in order to justify the narrative. That led to Patriot Act. Then you had fake anthrax operations to say it was Saddam Hussein and Iraq. Then you had Iraq, Sudan, Libya, everything that led to basically Iran, where we are right now. All of that was a mechanism for rolling over the Ponzi scheme and extracting wealth and dumping all the debts on the US government so that the American people could pay for it. That creates extreme wealth inequality. And you had complete subordination of government by the FIC. Because as soon as you went away from the gold standard, there was no resistance on the debt. There was no mechanism for any country doing anything. So then you had the dollar milkshake theory, where all of the countries were lending and buying treasuries. Treasuries became the most liquid and backed up by the petrodollar. But what happened during Trump administration 1? Massive change. America became an energy exporter and energy neutrality. That broke the petrodollar. And so the deep state, effectively the uni party, had to regime change from that moment. Because now what was happening? The Gulf countries, America didn't need the Gulf countries for energy anymore. And so now you've got America competing with the Middle East to export their energy, oil and LNG. And so where did the Middle East go? Well, remember, China joined the World Trade Organization, and effectively America set about asset stripping all the American people and creating a hyper-financialized economy. They wanted to financialize, securitize, and later tokenize every aspect of America. And then they outsourced all the manufacturing to China. And so China built the manufacturing base to the point where the military industrial complex couldn't create a weapon without China. And so China then managed to get all the rare earth minerals with Africa and all these different things that we're seeing right now. And the military industrial complex became fully subordinate to FIC. And FIC now didn't need the petrodollar. And the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, where were they getting all their money? They were selling all their energy to China. So China now says, hey, we don't want a Middle East that props up the petrodollar for America. We're going to create BRICS and de-dollarize. And so the Uni Party set about creating a managed transition away from the petrodollar system by strategically weakening the dollar. So they broke the Japan carry trade slowly. They used Trump in order to ruin the European relationship with NATO. And then they broke the petrodollar with the Gaza genocide and the Iran war.
Wow. Lots to unpack there, Simon. I want to take, because I want to take the rest of the podcast to insert a little bit of optimism in here. Because like clearly, as you've so eloquently described, and how I've noticed as well, clearly, the American people, or I would say most people in their countries, don't really have control over the destiny of the future of their countries. I think we can all agree to that at this point. It's clearly undeniable. But what I would say is, Simon, I think there's two elements that I'm seeing that I think have changed the game, so to speak. First was the rise of social media and the ability for us to have these types of conversations, and then these types of conversations directly sent to our viewers, therefore bypassing the gatekeepers of information that I think governments were used to having for, I would say, until the age of social media. And you saw how much pushback they really gave when the majority of people started consuming information via social media rather than the legacy media. And then the other, I would say, pivotal shift that I think is coming is the disintermediation of kind of money and state, right? And I think we're in the very early innings of that. Do you think that those two things, the disintermediation of information and the disintermediation of money, are going to play a role in people really reclaiming back their financial sovereignty? And when I mean that, I don't mean, reclaiming back, the nation state. I think the nation state is an aged model in my view. But really reclaiming financial sovereignty over themselves. All right. And then of course that gives them the ability to vote with their feet, go to more favorable jurisdictions. Where does Bitcoin fit into all of this? Like, what's your take?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to take people to a dark place because
No, let's do it.
once you know how the system works, you know how to win. The biggest problem in the world is that the people that are winning, those that control the FIC, which is, as I said, a network of wealth that is transnational. It doesn't have an America first agenda. It doesn't have a European first agenda. It doesn't have a UK first agenda. It doesn't have a Canada, Australia first agenda. It is complete asset stripping for the FIC. Okay. Once you know that, you realize, so our government are captured, they don't work for us. That's not going to change. You're not going to change it. The only way you change it is by playing the rules that they play by. And the rules that they play by is that they buy the politicians. And that's what the lobbies do. They know that politics is a pay-to-play system. And so that's the only game that you can win. You vote with your money. Now, immediately, most people think, well, I don't really have any money. I'm in debt. Or I've got money, but what do I do? I think the most important thing to understand is that the wealthy are going to change the system. So you're either wealthy or you're not. But it is only the wealthy that get to play the political game. Once you know the rules, you focus where you can make a difference. How do you impact the wealthy? You impact the wealthy by boycotting the constructs that allow the FIC to have their power. And that's what everybody can do. Everybody can do it. When I first discovered how this system works, and it's been a life obsession for 25 years, the first thing I tried to do was get involved in politics. And then I realized that the politicians weren't going to listen to anything. I was asking politicians to change the system when they were being paid by the people that I was trying to take their power away from. Useless. So then I tried to be involved in, teaching at the educational system. I got chucked out of London School of Economics. I got chucked out of Birkbeck. I got chucked out of University College of London. The university was the establishment. They don't even teach you how money works in reality in economics because they're training you for the debt-based system, for the FIC. So then I said, why don't I create my own bank, a non-fractional reserve bank where people could own their money? I I got rejected by the Bank of England. They said you need $60 million to continue this business plan, £60 million. And then they said, and also you need to build it on top of another bank. So they said, you build it on Barclays. So I'm saying, so I want full reserve, but I need to take my customers' full reserves and put them in a fractional reserve bank so that they get the money. Okay, yes, that's how the system works. So, all right. So then I was like, can I get direct access to the Bank of England? And they said, no, you got to have a full banking license. So basically, then I realized there's no point in that. This is the point when I discovered Bitcoin. This was 2011, and I was invited to the first Bitcoin in Prague. And Bitcoin was about $3. And I realized, wow, this technology exists outside the system. It was all the things that I was trying to create in a bank. Money you can own, money you can spend, and then money that has a fixed supply that takes on the central bank from the debasement and money printing. So then I said about investing in all the companies. And I invested in Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, Bitfinex, Circle, over 100 different companies in the sector. They all went public and became banks. And so they became a part of the establishment. Then I started looking at investing in other people. They all became Bitcoin treasury companies and subordinate to Wall Street. Then I started looking at how can I use my Bitcoin, and I put some money in Celsius and realized that these are all scams as well that are trying to get you to borrow against your Bitcoin. And I just went through the whole cycle and realized that our sector keeps getting sucked in and sucked in. And then they came a mechanism for getting everyone to leave their Bitcoin in custody with Coinbase and a BlackRock ETF. And BlackRock ended up with the most profitable ETF based upon Bitcoin. And everyone kept buying MicroStrategy shares or a Bitcoin ETF and then borrowing against their Bitcoin. And then everyone was giving Wall Street more power with their Bitcoin. And so here's how we win. They will use Bitcoin to make their system more powerful. I've submitted to that. We're not going to fix the system. But what we can do is opt out and boycott the system, which is exactly how Bitcoin was designed. So you can home mine if you want to compete with the central bank. You can hold it in self-custody if you want to compete with the custodians. And you can buy Bitcoin if you want to compete with the Fed. And then you can take your wealth and you can join a lobby if you want and try and change the system once you're wealthy. Or you can just opt out of the large, thick portfolio companies and go local. Support your farmers, support local spending, support your local communities, wherever you can. Don't borrow against your Bitcoin unless it's part of a managed plan and it's a minority of it. So you can boycott the Fed by owning Bitcoin. You can boycott BlackRock by holding it in self-custody rather than an ETF. You can boycott the banks by not borrowing against it. You can boycott transnational capital, multinational institutions by building your own parallel supply chains. Once you become sovereign, get out of cities, go urban, like build your own parallel systems, parallel networks, build your own decentralized social media platforms. We contribute to that. Invest in companies that are investing. The real battle, there is no borders, there is no country. This is a technical industrial complex, police and surveillance state that is being built by FIC. And the best you can do is exit and just don't support it. And we were given that gift. Satoshi Nakamoto open sourced this project. I believe originally this was meant to be an intelligence agency project. And it came out as open source code. And that open source code had many, many infiltration attempts at centralization. There were hard forks to try and put us onto a new chain. There were trying to get us into stable coins. There were attempts to centralize developers through funding different companies. There were every attempt. There was centralization of mining. There was all sorts of stuff. But the network remained as decentralized as it could be, where there was a geographically diverse network of Bitcoin miners in countries that hosted in countries that hate each other. Some private, some public, some sovereign, some national, some international, some decentralized around different structures. We managed to keep the node networks where we could keep the miners accountable as long as you run your own node. We were able to fight back against the custodians by opting out of the exchanges. And every time someone left it in an exchange, they got rug pulled and they started rebuilding in self-custody, having more resilience by owning their own Bitcoin. And when every time they try to infiltrate the developers, we get competing implementations. We get competing node structures. We get hard forks, soft forks. We get an open source boardroom. When we take our eye off the ball, somebody comes along and says, hey, why were they doing these things? Who are the developers? We need to understand more about them. And suddenly we get all those attention. So all this to say, I am extremely hopeful and grateful that we are able to exit, we are able to boycott. And I spent my whole life, and it wasn't until 2011 that I discovered there was actually a way of doing it. And anybody can do it. And all you need to do is implement some simple rules. Spend less than you earn, invest the difference in sovereign assets. If you want to do it with gold in self-custody, fine. But Bitcoin in self-custody is where you can exit your country when your country gets too oppressive. You can send it to anyone in the world when you want to support new supply chains anywhere in the world. You can self-mine from anywhere. You can take cheap energy in one country and you can plug into a self-mining network. You can memorize a phrase and you can take that with you wherever you want to go. And nobody can take it unless they physically get you. You can spend it in an innocent until proven guilty system. And no central bank can debase it. That changes the world for you if you use it the way Bitcoin was originally designed. But they're going to try and steal it. They're going to psyop you into custodians and centralization. And we've all learned it. I fell for them all. The reason I can share this is because I've done everything wrong in Bitcoin in my 15 years of being involved. So I have massive hope. And what is the future of the world? The future is decentralization, no doubt about it. We need decentralized social media. We need to take what we did in Bitcoin. We need to take layer 2 payment networks. And the only people that are going to make this are sovereign individuals, sovereign companies, and sovereign countries. And as these big constructs break down, have no doubt about it, this is the deconstruction of federal government structures replaced with transnational control grids. It's only the people that are opt out that are going to have the skills of owning their own private keys and the security of knowing how to protect themselves. And there's only going to be a few people that do that, sadly. And you're the ones that are going to be the elites that effectively bring a new form of responsibility. And so build those parallel systems, because it's at the end is you, your family, your community, and the people around you and the systems you build. And Bitcoin is the base layer for that.
Hey man, I absolutely love the way you articulated that, Simon. And I've said many times, right? It's Bitcoin or slavery. If enough of us take self-custody, we'll win, and there's nothing they can do about it. So I haven't spent 25 years going down the rabbit hole you've gone down, but in the decade that I've been, it's interesting to me that I've come to these very similar conclusions. And also too, I think, Simon, this particular cycle, I think the thing that troubled me the most was the financialization of Bitcoin by that complex. And the conversation moved from, this revolutionary this revolutionary zeal that was happening, and you felt it on X, you felt it in the community, you felt people really wanted this change, and it became about which, again, a lot of these people are my friends, so I'm not trying to pick on any of them, but it became about the treasury companies. It became about the ETFs. That was really what was popular in the news cycle. And if you make content, you kind of have to talk about the things that are being discussed in the news cycle. And I think this previous cycle, it was the paper Bitcoin summer. It was Bitcoin financialized. And I think a lot of people forgot why we are here. We are here to fix the money, fix the world. And the only way you do that is by buying Bitcoin, earning Bitcoin, mining Bitcoin, and putting that Bitcoin into self-custody. That has not changed, right? Of course, you can take risks with a small percentage of your portfolio. But ultimately they are risks, and ultimately you have to be aware that it doesn't equate to Bitcoin and self custody, right? And you have to acknowledge the risks that come with whatever it is that you decide to do.
Yeah, the right way to frame that is, you have spending money. Most people need money in a bank. They can't take currency risk. You want to minimize that to risk manage. But then you have saving. Bitcoin is my savings. But if I then do something with it, I use it as collateral, or I purchase a share instead of a Bitcoin, or I hold it in exchange, you no longer have Bitcoin. And so you now have some kind of investment vehicle with counterparty risk. And, it's not Bitcoin at that stage. So anytime you do something with your Bitcoin, it's no longer your Bitcoin in most cases. And so that's the way to think about it.
Absolutely. It's a form of IOU, I would say. And again, there's the counterparty risk that you're talking about. But I love how this ended up going full circle, right? You started describing exactly, who runs the world, right? What is the actual situation in terms of people and their governments? Um, and then we ended with the solution. And now I kind of want to end the podcast with this, Simon. What is your vision for the world, 10, 20 years from now, as the Bitcoin ethos and the adoption of Bitcoin inevitably spreads? I fundamentally believe that Bitcoin is not just a financial innovation, Simon. I think it is not only a revolution, but I also believe that it is a political and cultural movement as well, specifically if you have Bitcoin in self custody. So, with all that being said, first of all, do you agree? And second of all, where do you see the world 10, 20 years from now?
Yeah. So I think, to quote Lynn Alden, nothing stops this train. And by nothing stops this train, we are shifting to a world of multipolarity. Nothing's going to stop that. So we're not going to have one dominant hegemon and one dominant empire, which means we're going to have multiple currencies, which brings multiple, rails that are needed in order to facilitate a world of multipolarity. We're already starting to see that the largest sovereign Bitcoin miner in the world, Iran, was able to build sovereign wealth as a jurisdiction. And immediately, when they wanted to change and accept currency for opening shipments in the Strait of Hormuz, Bitcoin was the currency that they could accept, and stable coins was the one that got confiscated. And the money in the bank was the one that's frozen right now. And I'm not talking about circumventing sanctions, because sanctions were lifted. That's not legal advice or anything like that. You need to understand what you're doing. I'm just saying that it gives you a glimpse of what the world is in for. Now, sadly, I would love to say, and I've debated Jeff Booth before, who I'm sure you've had on your show. And he believes Bitcoin's going to fix everything. I don't subscribe to that. I think Bitcoin is going to create a next cycle of elites, and your job is to become one of those elites. And the rest are going to hold it in custody and make the FIC more powerful. And I don't think anything's going to change that. And so it's going to be a small minority of Bitcoiners that will stay to the Bitcoin ethos. And with that responsibility becomes the responsibility that comes with you being an elite if you see the cycle all the way through. So what do I think the future of the world is? Well, the fall of the US empire into a regional hegemon rather than global hegemon, I think, is inevitable, predictable, guaranteed from here, because FIC's doing it. And so that means that effectively it's the rise of the countries that are on the wrong side of the bomb. And so America was on the right side of the bomb, and everyone else, or a lot of other countries, are on the wrong side of the bomb. So remember, capital flows. And so you will see other currencies outperform the dollar. You will see other stock markets outperform the S&P. But in a neutrality world, you've got Bitcoin and you've got gold, and those two exist. And so Bitcoin allows you to ride this wave wherever it goes. But you can also take that wherever you want to go, because there will be losers, winners, and we will enter into a new empire. People think like a fourth turning is the end of all the world. No, it's going to get worse and worse. The living standard in the West is going to get worse and worse. Nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change that. The FIC is going to extract everything that it can, but it's going to redeploy that capital into the global South, where the populations are. Africa, the country that was on the wrong side of the bombs and the extraction. Southeast Asia, those countries are going to rise. China's going to be investing around the world. It's going to be a different thing. I'm not saying you live in China. I'm not saying you have to like what the CCP is. But China does not have a track record of trying to bomb the world. So you don't have to live in the places that benefit from that. But you need to be sovereign as a sovereign individual. And that's what Bitcoin enables for you.
Absolutely.
So to me, sadly, it's not going to change the world, but it's going to allow you to exit. And you as an elite, you can try and change the world. And that's what I think you can do.
100%. And I agree with that, because, and I've talked about this as well, right? Like, I think that as Bitcoin continues to increase in price, if you define what an ultra high net worth individual, there's about 250,000 of them on Earth. It's someone who has $30 million worth of assets or more. And if Bitcoin reaches a $300 or $400 or $500,000 price point, about 30 to 40% of those individuals are going to be Bitcoiners, right? So, and those individuals that are worth that amount of money and more are really the ones that have the most amount of influence in society. Like that's undebatable. Now, my question to you, Simon, and I'm sure the audience is going to enjoy this question, is how much Bitcoin do you need to be in the new elite?
Yeah, I think it's very individual. It depends where you live, depends on circumstances. I think everyone should try and play the cost arbitrage. Make sure you live somewhere where the costs are lower. You earn somewhere where you can take advantage of that arbitrage. You need to maximize the differential between your income and your expenses. And you need to own more Bitcoin every month. And you need to do that for 10 years. And you need to not deviate that. And you don't need to look at the price. If the price is going down, great, you're going to have more Bitcoin. If the price is going up, then your fiat net worth is going up. Just think of it like that. And mine as much fiat currency in order to get as much Bitcoin so that you can exit the system. It's impossible for me to say, for you, because people have they've got different responsibilities. You've got college, you've got families, you've got countries. Like, I can't give that type of financial advice. Your job is just to own more this month than last month and do that for at least 10 years. And we'll come back on this podcast I'm sure you'll still be here in 10 years. And I did that for the previous 10 years. And, since $3, I've been telling people to do that. And my network of millionaires, billionaires, elites, people that got wrecked and everything, are people that are actually changing the world behind the scenes. And so, yeah, set yourself a goal. What's right for you? Like, gain some financial literacy. Learn how to read your personal balance sheet, your personal income statement. I'll leave you with this thing. Look, when I was deep in debt, because I was deep in debt when I first discovered Bitcoin. For me, I had like £250,000 in debt when I first discovered Bitcoin. I felt my business was rinsing me. I'd left my job. My last bit of credit card debt was to go and speak at that first Bitcoin conference. It was my wife that actually allowed us to take our last bit of money, scrimp together a flight, and go and speak at that conference. But I had to make a decision. And I'm not saying this is the right decision for you because there's consequences to it. But I just defaulted on my debt and decided to buy Bitcoin instead.
I did the same thing. I maxed out all my credit cards in 2016 to buy Bitcoin.
Yeah. So I defaulted on it all and just bought more Bitcoin because I needed to break the cycle somehow.
Man.
I'm not saying that's right for you. There's consequences, there's FICO scores, there's all sorts of stuff. But the things they don't want you to know is how this system works. Because you know what breaks the system? What breaks the system is when you don't pay your debt, because the whole thing is debt.
And of course, this is
Do
not
with that as you please.
this is not financial advice, right? We're not giving financial advice. We're not talking about all of that. We're just talking about our personal experiences.
Yeah.
Simon
I
Dixon,
did come back and pay it for the record. I came back and negotiated a settlement, but it was only once I had a few years in order
of
to
course,
get Bitcoin.
of course.
effect.
Yeah, because then it negatively affects you. You can't get a car. You can't, the system, essentially excludes you out of it unless you, you settle it. But Simon, it's been an absolute honor. I've heard you so many times, not only on your own channel, on other podcasts, but it's been a pleasure to actually have this conversation with you myself. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on, and hope to have you on the show again in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You can follow me on X. That's where I kind of give real time updates. I got a YouTube channel, and what I found is I do very long analysis on Bitcoin, tech, money, geopolitics. Sometimes like 3-4 hours every week. It's like a discipline for me, just to keep me doing it. But I kind of break. I'm trying to use AI to take my 4-hour rant and put it in 10 minutes. And so I publish those on my blog, SimonDixon.com. No sponsorship, no monetization, no business model, no products or anything. I just do it because I want as many people to be a part of this as possible, because I think we got some rough times ahead, and you need to know a storm is coming so that you can build your house, prepare your house, get your raincoat, get your umbrella, because everyone else is telling you it's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine. You need to prepare.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Simon. Appreciate it.